Good evening. Welcome to the February 25th meeting of the Planning Board. We have a number of items on the agenda for my colleagues and for those present. Thanks to the nimble work of HCAM, we are televised this evening, not live, but for posterity. So I think there are going to be a number of folks that are interested in some of our discussions, particularly around the proposed zoning articles, so that's why it's being taped. So thank you to HCAM for that. And as always, we're being recorded for the transcript as well. Couple of items off the bat. For Derby Street Shops, there's a request for a waiver for site plan review in association with the building permit for three projects, all of which technically exceed the 20,000 square feet. But they're all interior work, which is not uncommon for that kind of activity up at Derby Street. 175 Derby Street, Unit 42, we have the cost of the improvements. 80 Research Road, and 94 Derby Street, Suite 267. I think, and I'll defer to my colleagues as well, but I think given the fact that this is pretty consistent with the activity and there's no exterior work, Mary, do you have information?
Just one point of clarification. We do have 175 Derby Street is technically not in the Derby Street Shops. It's the condominium complex. I'll pass down a map that shows you. You're 100% correct, except that these are not all in the Derby Street Shops. One of them is, so hence the confusion. So 175 Derby Street is internal renovations to a commercial condominium unit.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought they were all units with a view of two. Okay. But only one of the first three. I understand. I'm sorry.
80 Research Road is industrial property. And then the last one on your list, 94 Derby Street, is, I understand, right next to the Apple spot.
Yes. We can take them in total, though, to waive? Or do we need to do them individually?
I would say that you should vote them individually.
All right, so why don't we do that unless my colleagues have questions?
So, just a quick question. None of these involve any program changes, just physical improvements inside the spaces. So
Yep.
there's no increase in any intensity of use or parking or anything like that.
Correct.
Okay.
The
All right.
proposals in front of you have a brief description of work on them. And so if you want, I can just read them to you quickly before you act, for the record. Okay, 175 Derby Street, Unit 42, no exterior work proposed. The work consists of interior renovations, including removing walls and kitchen area, replace a few walls and a kitchen sink, cabinet, dishwasher, bathroom, replace vanities and 2 sinks, requesting a waiver from site plan review. And the total cost of that work is $27,935. So it triggers that action.
Sure, let's do it that way. So I will entertain a motion to waive the site plan review for 175 Derby Street, Unit 42.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The second one before you is 80 Research Road. The cost of improvements, $154,100. No exterior work. Remove and dispose of current drop ceilings and left wing of the building. Remove current offices and walls depicting in drawings. Install new dividing walls for new size offices. This is a current office building and will remain as is. All interior alterations with no exterior work proposed.
All right.
Sounds fine.
Then I will entertain a motion to waive site plan review as there's no exterior work for 80 Research Road.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And the final one is at Derby Street Shops, and it's 94 Derby Street, Suite 269. It was an error. It says Suite 267, but it is 269. And the brief description of work, we are going to do only interior work such as painting, new floor, and track lighting, requesting a waiver from site plan review. There's no outside work.
I will entertain, unless there's any discussion, I'll entertain a motion to waive site plan review for 94 Derby Street, Suite 269.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
So that is those, our first item. The next is for the Derby Street shops, a request for a waiver of site plan review and the requirements of a public hearing associated with a special permit A2. This is to allow for a new use in Suite 123, which is in that the first, the Pavilion Building, where other side from Panera. Right.
Yep, completely.
And are we getting an updated parking table?
It's coming
Oh, great.
down now.
Great.
Victoria brought a nice exhibit that shows the unit as well in a light blue.
Was this originally the photography store?
Pardon me?
Was this originally the photography store? The camera store?
Yeah.
Okay.
Way back when.
I've
Long
frequented
memories on
it
the
many
board.
times.
Long memories.
It's too bad it's not there anymore.
All we're doing is interior alterations. The use requires less parking than the present retail use. We have to go to the Board of Appeals obviously for it, but there's no exterior site work at all. Just interior alterations and a new sign.
What's the current use, Bob, there?
I'm sorry?
What's the current use?
It's a shop called Elburn. It's retail.
It's retail.
That's a pop-up. It was a temporary tenant.
So the bank proposed is basically a retail use, so it's the same parking?
No, it's less parking
Less
according to
parking.
the zoning code.
Okay.
4 spaces, 1,000 versus
Versus
5,000.
4 or 5,
Which
okay.
is the reason for the new parking.
Right,
Okay.
but you all did so much work updating the parking plan and all that kind of stuff that for us to be able to maintain the parking table as much as we can. I think it's gonna help us all going forward, just so we can keep track.
Yeah.
The retail's 4.5 spaces per 1,000, bank's 4 spaces. Okay.
So the applicant's asking you under section 1I5 to determine that this is a minor site plan because there's no exterior renovations to the site and this is not triggering a revised A3. And they'd ask you that to then further waive the requirement for public hearing and then waive site plan review.
I will make such a motion.
So the zoning board would be having a separate hearing about the use, the change in use.
About an A2, right.
Correct. They're having an A2 and we have to do site plan with
Okay, I
it.
just want to confirm that.
That's correct. And so
So we are,
this new exhibit will also be incorporated into the ZBA's project as well.
And are we certain that the number of seats on the restaurant use is now accurate and in compliance with the permit?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
yeah, that was the other big part of the effort that we were doing in 2018 that we're also gonna wanna continue to keep track of as we do the parking.
Thank you.
All right, I'll go ahead and make a motion to find that this proposal constitutes a minor site plan because there are no modifications to the site, and further to waive the requirement for public hearing and to waive site plan review.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Let you out early this evening. Thank you very much, Victoria. You're welcome to stay. Welcome, John. The next item is a discussion of site plan review in accordance with Section 4-B.6.b for 3A Jordan Way, Canterbury LLC. Welcome back.
I want to know, did I missed the initial the initial presentation on this matter, but I did review the recording that Mary kindly made for me, and I will execute the Mullins affidavit as necessary.
Terrific. We're okay to start, right? It's
Actually-
7:14.
Actually, the Mullins Bill's talking about is for Lot 2A. This is our opening hearing on this one.
Oh, okay,
This is
thank-
3, right, there
Yeah.
was,
I thought this was 2A.
No, but thank
Got it.
you.
All right, I'm gonna hold off on that then.
okay.
Then I didn't miss anything.
You didn't miss a thing. This is
Move
our
to strike.
first,
You are current.
your current.
Wait, but the letter we have here,
There's a typo in John's
Yeah,
second
John-
bullet.
John's letter refers to 2A.
In the second bullet.
Subject line is right.
The
the
subject
subject line is
that's right.
correct.
That's right.
So I believe he used the last template for the 2A.
And-
But I have read this, I've discussed it with John, it's all accurate and pertinent to this
To
project.
3A.
It
right.
is.
Good evening, everybody. John Wood, the builder, Hingham resident. Gary is not here tonight. He did not make it back from South Carolina. So I would be giving the overview before he would answer any questions. So I'll do my best to complete as much as I can.
And as Mary said, we have John Chessie's letter, but we don't have John Chessie for purposes of discussion this evening either, so.
Either, okay.
The questions are probably going
Okay.
to be a little bit
Yep,
shorter.
very good. So, Lot 3A is the lot that you see right here. It's the first one on your left as you come up the subdivision.
Canterbury's on top, right?
Yeah, Canterbury is up here. Yeah. And Lot 3A is the first lot on your left as you come up Jordan Way, the subdivision road. It's entered via a driveway right here. This is a 4-bedroom house that's a little over 4,000 square feet on sewer. It's connected to sewer. A couple of things that we've done. We rotated the house. It was facing in this direction, and we rotated it. We felt that it fit the lot better. The utilities come right in off of the side instead of the driveway, kind of more of a direct connection to the house, the water, the gas, and the electric, the underground electric. The sewer is located over here. This is another lot that has a tree preservation in it, and this is the dotted line that you see up here. And below that is a retaining wall, another retaining wall up over here that on one of the other sheets has, I think it's the grading sheet, has the detail. It's going to be similar to Lot 2A's retaining wall in that it'll be kind of a dry laid using the stone that we have on site. The drainage and the roof drainage come in over here and connect to the drainage treatment holding that come in and then come over to an outfall on the other side of the retaining wall. I do have this is a couple of copies. I in your way? You want me on the other side?
Just as long as you're speaking into the mic.
Okay. There we go.
So,
Anyway, that is the elevation of the house, so you get a feel for what it looks like.
that's the view from the cul-de-sac, right?
What's that?
That's the view from the cul-de-sac, basically?
That's the view, actually, when you just come up the
Come down the
driveway,
driveway, right,
that's
right.
what you'd get, yeah. Yeah. So John has some bullet points here. The house footprint is about 35 square feet larger, so it's about the same size. It's been rotated.
The drainage is different, though, right? Do you need that
The drainage, it's the same kind of drainage that we're discussing in 2A, that will be as far as the roof system. And Gary will be providing some calculations on that so that it shows that this is sufficient. And I think when I see you again on the 11th, I believe, of March for Lot 2A, we'll have visited this type over there and kind of discuss and agree or disagree as to whether or not the system that was designed originally,
Designed and approved.
what's that?
Designed and approved. right?
Designed and approved, that it wasn't really added into the calculations of the overall stormwater. So the idea was to put less of a structure in the ground that would sufficiently provide the calculations of what's needed. So it's kind of something that Gary and John will discuss and finish showing the board, and this is kind of the exact same thing.
Can I
It-
elaborate on that?
Go ahead, please.
So, for the board, you'll recall when you reviewed the subdivision on this lot and 2A, we did have underground, basically, chambers, right, to collect the water. And these lots could not meet the standards for recharge, but in order for the planning board to consider granting a waiver towards some of the drainage requirements, which you ultimately did, the applicant had to prove that they made every effort to meet the recharge standards as practicable. And one of the ways that they did that was to put these underground chambers, understanding that there wouldn't be a lot of recharge just due to the ledge and the characteristics of this material. This particular change here, I've discussed in depth with John Chesia. This is proposing an alternate drainage system than the planning board really reviewed in great detail. And it's not clear if there's any benefit to changing it except for perhaps cost to the applicant. I know that John and Gary and John will discuss it more outside of the board, but from staff's perspective, this is one of those items that, why reinvent the wheel? The board spent a great deal of time reviewing the drainage, and depending on what the drainage is, there's a condition on your subdivision approval that says if you substantially alter your drainage as approved, you have to modify your subdivision. So unless there was some compelling interest as to why this is so much better for the project, the environment, you know, for the planning board to accept the switch, why not just stay with what's already been designed and reviewed in this instance? I know that's a decision point for the board. If John were here, he would be presenting that to you, and that is why I am sharing it with you. And that's what John is talking about with that bullet point.
Yeah, and I understand that. I think that consistent, my concerns are the same, that the system is different, but also we don't have any supporting data, so it's a hypothesis at this point. As to quantifying how this one would improve what we had originally approved upon in our last subdivision review. So I think that I would be more comfortable if you could, or if Gary could respond to these concerns back to John, and then John could get back to us with his response, because right now it's not really quantified, and it's really hard to assess what the change might be and why.
Understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
You think they'll be able to do that in time to get us some information prior to the 11th?
I think
I mean-
so, yeah. I know that Gary's gonna be working on some things either tomorrow or Wednesday. And I do owe some things to Mary as well. And I'll be able to get that information. Again, I agree, it's a change. It's, instead of the 2 chambers, excuse me, the 4 chambers were down to 2. And it wasn't really, again, affecting the calculations, but it's, I mean, if it's something that the board wants me to do, just to stay in line with what was, then certainly.
Well,
Yeah,
certainly want to see the
but
calculations.
Yep. I know the calculations were submitted for the one on 2A for the 11th already, and it would be the kind of the same write-up for this one. So the calculations are in, but I don't think John has had a chance to look at them.
Right.
Okay.
To respond to.
John, is there a
board.
relationship between changing the orientation of the house and the drainage and the grades? I'm just
No,
curious
it
as to the
just- It
rationale.
just gave more of a backyard.
Okay, so there's no relationship there from an
No.
engineering or a technical perspective?
Nope, we just thought that it gave a bigger backyard. It fit kind of well with where it was in relation to the cul-de-sac. It was really along those lines.
Is this a design that somebody has requested from you? The design that the elevation you showed us? Or is it spec?
There is somebody interested as far as the exact design. That's something that we've gone forward with.
Seems unusual because the front door isn't really the front, most houses that look like that have a centered front door, so I was just wondering if that was a particular design or that if somebody had requested just
Right.
a little bit
Right.
different looking than what I'm not an architect, but it just seems a little odd.
We're trying to come up with some different colonial feel, New England feel. We don't want to repeat, so to speak. And that's the design that we looked at and tweaked. And actually, there is somebody interested now in this lot.
I was curious, John, too, along those lines, the main entrance is in a recessed plane from the bay window, or from the projection on the center, and so the garage also has a very prominent place relative to entrance too, and I didn't know if that was intentional too, in terms of maybe setting the garage back, or whether that was related to the orientation too.
At first, we had an angled garage and it wasn't working, so we kept the house straight but did rotate it. Thought it was a nicer approach, and it again gave a bit more of a backyard.
Can you see this house? This house is a little bit downgrade. Can you see this house from the road by the pond, by the dam? From that orientation, looking up, can you see the house?
You know, that's a good question.
From Weir Street?
From Weir
All
Street
the
at
way
the
over
dam.
on Weir Street?
Can you, I mean, it's a pretty straight shot, but maybe there's a grade.
I think I can bring in a picture of that shot, because I've taken it, standing on the dam. And I think it's up and to the left, out of sight, I think.
Yeah, the reason I ask is I was just curious of the,
Standing on the
Yeah.
dam down here.
yeah, it's a little bit to the right. Yeah, I'm just asking.
Standing on the dam,
Yeah.
it would be across the pond up and to the left.
I got it. So it's really behind the curved house that's by the step stone walls.
Yeah.
Because you'll see, I was just thinking about the other one on 2A, I guess, and what the perspective was that relative to the view corridor. Okay. We can look at that when we get to 2A, I guess. All right.
Other questions?
I do owe you a couple of things, which is a better grading sheet, which was one of the issues that John had mentioned. Gary's gone a little overboard when you requested the old border. So that's going to be a little more narrow and transparent, but at least be able to see the lot lines. And I think that's about it.
All right. So I think we have a plan for Gary and John Chesia to reconvene, hopefully to resolve these issues and get us some information prior to the 11th.
So from a point of process, these plans are in pretty good shape. There's just those minor issues that are outstanding. The 11th is 2 weeks from today. So if we're going to do that, I just wonder how quickly John will get the information, because we can bump it to the 11th, but if we don't get the information in a timely fashion, we may not be prepared, right?
You said it much more directly than I did. That's what I was alluding to, is that, right, we don't want to get the information on the 9th, right? That's, so we can continue the 11th and then see where you
we
are.
Continue it out past the 11th if we have to.
So if that's the board's preference, then you do have a full agenda on the 11th, but I do think some of those items will move off. And this is probably an 85% condition, so we would need a request in writing to continue. I think Sherry probably has the form for that. And the decision deadline is March 15th, so I would ask the applicant, if we're continuing the hearing to March 11th, would he request to extend the decision date to April 11th, which is our typical plus 30.
That's fine.
So that would be the motion.
Then I will entertain a motion to continue the hearing on 3A Jordan Way, Canterbury LLC to March 11th and extend the decision deadline to April 11th.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
See you in a couple weeks, John.
Could I just ask one quick question? I'm a little slow here on this plan review. Just a question for John. I'm looking at the detail on the last sheet on 2 of 4, where the foundation is set down into the ledge.
Yep.
And is the grading of that relative to the drainage of the ledge, is that shown on John's, or has John addressed that? I mean, has Gary addressed that? It looks like it's in a swale in the ledge, the foundation of the house
No,
looks like it's in a swale.
It will come out.
It comes out
It-
at a certain point.
It will be grading. Are you talking, will the grading be up against the foundation? Yes. The plan that you see is just some of the things that is done for being on crushed ledge and gravel.
I just want to make sure that that wasn't the lowest point, and there was a point of discharge that went out on grade. Okay. Thank you. All righty.
Way ahead schedule here.
We're ahead of schedule.
It never happens.
But you
Sherry's
can't,
got some minutes.
but you can't leave. Yeah, we can do minutes.
No, thank you so much, John.
So just pass the 3
So
down.
just take 2 sheets and pass it on. The first that's coming down is a 3-pager. So you'll take two sheets.
Busy meeting.
Here's the second set. Well,
Unfortunately, Mary, I found out today that I will not be here on March 11th.
okay.
I just wanted to let you know that.
Yeah, just talk to you. There you go. And this one, I think you just take.
Wait, February 11th. Which do you have there? 11th.
Yeah, and this is the 13th, it's just one sheet.
So is the parcel 2A, is that on for the 11th?
Yeah. So do you need to ask those? No.
I must say, Sherry, this notebook is helpful. It's very helpful, being able to collate all this.
Any comments or questions on the minutes from February 11th?
Just a second. The only thing on 73 Abington is we asked for some evergreen trees for the screening. Did we ask for any deciduous trees too, or did we just ask for evergreens? I'm thinking in that downslope area, looking up at the large mass of the building. I thought we asked for both, I could be wrong.
Yeah, honestly, I'd have to go back and read it.
Yeah.
Read the decision.
My recollection from the decision was that it was the evergreens.
I think it's fine in the minutes to just say trees if the
Yeah, as long as
decision
the
talks
decision
about the
shows it, yeah.
specific kind, right? Well, I would make a motion that we approve the minutes of February 11th as written.
Second. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
I will abstain as I was not present.
One abstention. February 13th, which was the
Wednesday night.
opening of the hearing of, or continuation of the hearing on the proposed changes to the bylaw.
I'll make a motion, we act favorably in the minutes of February 13th, 2019.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any administrative reports you want to cover, Mary? Should we, because we can't really start until 8 o'clock, right, now that it's...
Can't, advisory is coming, Susan Murphy's joining us for the
Sure.
zoning articles.
Can we take a break?
Can we
Yes,
recess
we
for a
can take
few?
a recess.
What do you have administrative? You wanna go?
I don't. We could put away our site plan review stuff and I can hand out some material, preparing for the next hearing.
Fair enough.
We have a meeting next Monday?
We do not. Thursday night this week,
Yes, about that.
we have advisory.
Thursday night?
Some of us Thursday night for zoning articles. I believe it's going to be whatever you vote tonight, as well as the enforcement item. And then next Monday, we do not have a meeting, but if you want to schedule one, we could.
Do we have a time for Thursday
I do not yet. We're going to ask them to not have it on the first thing, because Gordon has a hard conflict right at 7. So I need to talk to them about it.
I just don't think I can make it back by 7
Yeah.
o'clock.
I mean, because last year, unfortunately, I have the Cub Scout Blue and Gold dinner. And I'm the scout leader, but I can try to go after
So-
dinner if it's later in the night. And
Okay, so
if it
later
goes
is better for you then.
I'll definitely try to make it.
Yeah,
I've
I'll
gotta go
be
to the dinner,
there.
And I'll be there.
Gordon will be there. We'll try to get it later.
Because last year, we had a couple of us go last year, and I thought that approach worked really well.
Yeah.
Because the previous years, usually the chair just goes.
Yeah.
But I actually thought the dialogue,
It was.
don't you think?
It's true.
Yeah.
I'm a strong believer in that, so.
So I will definitely try to go.
When I know for certain what time the window will be on, I'll share it with everybody.
I'll do my best to make it for you.
Thank you.
If several of you think you'll go, maybe I should just post it.
Yeah, why don't you?
So that if more than
Just in
3
case,
of you
yeah.
show up, you can
Yeah.
all speak. Okay, we'll post it
That's why
tomorrow.
I brought it up, yeah.
Yep.
Have any of our articles gone to the advisory yet, or?
They have, the 2 zoning board timeframe ones went the other night, and
master
the
plan.
Conservation Commission.
Yeah, and the master.
Oh, yeah,
And the
the Concom,
master planning
right,
ones.
Okay, those are all gone, okay.
All right, shall we recess? (8:02), returning to the February 25th meeting of the Planning Board for the continuation of the hearings on the proposed zoning articles. We've had a number of conversations on these. We're happy to have our colleagues from advisory with us this evening as we hopefully work through all of these. I think in consultation, we're going to take them a little bit out of order since I think some of them are going to need a little bit more work than others. So we're going to start with Article EEE, which is some changes to the special permit and site plan review process. Most of these changes relate to compliance with the MS4 program, which is a state permit that the town has to comply with. We've talked at some length with most of those. I don't know if there are any further comments. Most of those just bring us into compliance with the state permit. I don't know if the board or advisory has any comments on those elements. They run through, help me, Mary.
They are called out in your bubbles, your comments that say that they're MS4 revisions.
Right.
And you'll recall that at the last hearing, we discussed the fact that 85% of these changes relate to ensuring compliance with the current MS4 permit that Randy has, and as such, town council would say that they're not, although certainly they're discretionary, you're the planning board, but she would strongly urge you to the extent that they're required for us to be compliant, to strongly consider them. They're related to stormwater management, erosion control procedures, as-built inspections, and I can run through them again, but they're fair, we have gone through them. So if you'd like me to run through them again, I can. If you are comfortable with them, then I suggest we focus on the other 2 kind of bigger conversations, which are the potential administrative process and then the site plan review kind of thresholds.
I think we move to the other 2. I mean, I'm fine with the MS4 compliance.
Yeah, I agree.
So the MS4 one, it's all basically keeping the impacts of changes on sites to away from the public infrastructure, and these are some of the comments. I was reading through some of your speaking points and some of the comments. I wasn't at the meeting last time, so I was coming up to speed on the written materials. But basically, any project that burdens the town resources, whether it be enforcement, safety, snow, road, off-site drainage, these are the areas that are, just want to make sure I have it clear. These are the MS4 considerations.
So MS4, if the board will indulge me for a moment, I'll go back through some of what I said to you at the end of the other night, for the record, and because we're more awake today. So this article was 85% of it, Gary, you're correct, triggered by the current MS4 permit. And I did hand you out a copy of that. This is what it looks like, and it's really in DPW's purview. We're kind of just a minor piece of it by virtue of our permitting. The MS4 is a conveyance or system of conveyances that, in our case, is owned by the town. It's not a combined sewer, and it's used to collect or convey stormwater. So we have private stormwater, which we have to manage on site, and then we have town stormwater. And so polluted stormwater typically will go through the municipal separate stormwater systems and then gets discharged into local water bodies. We have a permit which has a list of action steps, and committed action steps are to revise our site plan regulations and our rules and regulations to put into writing what we are doing to support the MS4 permit. And as point of reference, we met with Randy and his consultant and Susan and I, and we talked about, are you requiring an as-built? Are you doing pre-construction meetings? Are you getting SWIP, Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plans? Many of the things that the MS4 permit wants to know that we're doing, we are actually doing, which is great for the town. The challenge is that if it's not specifically called out in your black and white regulations, when all of you are off the board and I'm gone and the staff that are here are gone, where is it in writing that it's going to continue to happen? And so some of these things about getting an as-built, we get as-builts now. It didn't say it here per se. So some of the changes that are being proposed are like that. What are the implications of the MS4 permit for the town? The town's required to manage and maintain the stormwater system. So having construction sites that are managed properly with regard to erosion control and stormwater, both during the active construction and then the post-construction forever and ever, are really important because it reduces the burden on the town with regard to cleaning our storm drain system in perpetuity and reduces public safety problems that are associated with ongoing discharge of drainage into the way. It also we also have ancillary abutter concerns about drainage. Once a site is constructed, the drainage needs to be properly managed on site and not flowing off site. So many of the edits in this article relate to modifying or inserting language about stormwater management, the SWIP, pre-construction and post-construction monitoring and erosion controls. Another bigger discussion in this article, which we will get to, is about possibly reducing the thresholds in Section IV-B.6.b that trigger site plan review. You'll recall that currently it's 20,000 square feet of disturbance of drainage pattern and 2,500 square feet alteration in areas with greater than 10% slopes. These smaller, unregulated construction sites present many challenges to the town. As the land in town becomes scarce and constrained, greater site intervention is needed to support increased development and larger houses that have more lot coverage. Many lots in town have existing constraints like ledge or high groundwater. An unintended result of the market pressures and lenient zoning, which is the Hatfield, are that the structures that exist now are demolished and rebuilt or added onto such that every square inch of buildable land is covered with a structure. We don't have a lot coverage limitation. Drainage design is typically an afterthought in these instances if there isn't site plan review, and except to the extent that landscapers will come in when the house is built and typically grade away from the structure, right, to protect the house. So we, police, building, DPW, and planning, receive complaints regarding public safety, drainage, icing in the roadways, and site disturbance impacts, erosion, drainage, loss of buffers, and screening. Many times the work, which is demo or rebuild or large additions or extensive landscaping work, doesn't trigger site plan review. Interestingly, we get a lot of calls saying, don't they need permits? And really the thresholds are high. So those lots that are not currently having the drainage oversight would benefit from site plan review consideration targeted to drainage, erosion control, and really the abutter impacts from stormwater. Those limited criteria of site plan review. When we don't have this review on the front end of construction, we're left to manage the impact at the back end, right? Are you proactive or reactive? I do have some other examples that I won't go into here, but I will just say that when we don't manage it up front, the financial burden is on the town, resources on the back end. And we're also seeing a financial willingness to fill steep slopes to build bigger houses or bigger yards. Where in the past you might buy a house that didn't have much of a yard and you knew, okay, I don't have a big yard. Now somebody might buy a lot that's like that, and you've had some in front of you recently. There's a willingness to build a massive retaining wall and fill it to create that. And it's a dramatic alteration of the landscape, which is fine, provided the drainage is reviewed so that the neighbors aren't affected and the dirt doesn't flow into the storm drainage system, at least from staff's perspective.
Two points that I was thinking about. You mentioned both of them, but I just want to go back to them. Proactive versus reactive. Totally supportive of a proactive plan that moves forward and gives these kinds of scrutiny and review to projects. What about the reactive projects? There's a number of projects that are cited. Current examples, current problems with it. Water's flowing out over the streets, is flowing over abutters' properties. I think this is a good first start, a set of prescriptive criteria that would basically say that there's a review process, and within that review process we have to maintain everything on site. But I think it gets into the next area of lot coverage, and it gets into density of building versus layout or available area of site. Because if 95 or 90% of or whatever high percentage of the area of the site is impervious, we can maintain all we want about it. It has to be contained within the site, but there becomes a certain point where it's almost impossible to do that unless you have a centralized stormwater drainage system that you can tap into. So I just bring that up because I think it's kind of begging another question, in terms of, in my mind, as to, we've talked a number of times about lot coverage criteria, and I don't know whether that's a logical follower to this type of an initiative.
That's a good point, but I think that's outside the scope of this year.
I
But,
just bring it up in terms of the constraints.
I mean, duly noted with regard to that. I did pull the large house regulations from Cohasset and from Wellesley. And in Cohasset, large house reviews are triggered for houses with a gross area, including garage, of more than 3,500 square feet, or lot coverage get greater than 10%. Right? So we don't have those restrictions, right? Could you imagine that?
Or I choose not to.
So, I mean, do you want me to keep going, Gordon?
Sure, yeah. I have a couple comments to make as well. You should go ahead.
Well, no, I just wanted to make an initial statement. Gary's right on target, and I did that, just to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Right. So when we were speaking about this 10 or 12 days ago, however many it was, I think those were the issues. Those were largely, Gary, the issues that we were talking about. There was some concern, though, whether we were being usurious for the property owners that might want to be putting an addition on. And I think that led to some of the conversations and the request of staff to come up with this more, shall we say, streamlined administrative review of sorts, so that we're not being overly burdensome, but we're also protecting both the neighbors and the town going forward from some of the consequences that Mary laid out. So I think that's what Mary and Susan have been working on, with some language relative to that. Then we'll get to the threshold question, but we wanted to talk about that slightly more slimmed down version of review, specifically related to those drainage issues that may come up from a project like that. And I think that's fair to say, right? I think it was largely your suggestion that we find some way to streamline it. It's not the most relevant element, but it's not irrelevant that full site plan review for any of these projects is going to substantially increase our agenda on a pretty regular basis potentially. So that's the other opportunity to perhaps streamline it as well, so that we can focus a bit more on both the planning and on the large projects that do come before us.
So just to understand, Gordon, one of the issues that I read in here was the having limited site plan review apply to lots that are smaller in area. And then the other one was a streamlining of some of the site plan review criteria for all of the lots.
That's right.
Of those 4B6.
Of those smaller. Smaller lots.
The new lot, the delta.
Which is no longer required to comply with site plan, or undergo site plan review.
Right, so if I, Mr. Chairman, do you want me to just jump in here? Sure. Okay, so there's two kind of things that Gordon just touched on. One was the administrative process, which Judy said when we were leaving last time that she wanted us to look into. And then the other piece is the limited site plan review. If you'll allow me, I think it makes more sense to go back to the administrative piece really briefly. The board did a couple of site plan waivers today for those site plan reviews that are interior work only, triggered by that 20,000 square foot requirement, that aren't a change in use. You know, really it's just someone's doing a bathroom, and it's not a residential, and it's not a project that's either come through the planning board or the zoning board for permitting. So it's those one-offs. If you look in your draft regulation, and it's under sub C, which is on the third piece of paper, and you've got a stapled track changes of the downtown Hingham overlay. It's Article Section 1. Yes. Yep, third page. And it should have been laid out for you tonight. So that big chunk of blue there under sub C speaks to this administrative process. And staff suggesting.
So Mary, it's the fifth face, right? It's
Yes.
this one here.
Yep.
Okay, so it's the fifth page.
The fifth page, the third sheet of.
Third sheet, but fifth page. Okay. It's big and blue. Okay.
What we're suggesting that the board consider, instead of spelling out every instance where the board may want to delegate authority to either a member of the planning board or staff to waive things in certain instances administratively, what this says is that the planning board is going to vote on a planning board rules of procedure. That's a document that you could vote on. The zoning board has it, right, for how they handle 40Bs, et cetera. You could vote on that at one of your meetings and lay out a framework for, you know, if it's a building permit greater than $20,000, no exterior work, the planning board authorizes this designee to handle it in the office. If it's a, you know, and then the rest of it could be if it's a limited site plan review below this threshold. You know, staff's suggestion to you is that this language here would say that you're going to adopt rules for how you want to handle delegation of authority on site plan reviews, but you're going to do it outside the bylaw. And I think that that's important for a couple of reasons. This says you're going to do it. You're going to vote to create these rules of procedures. But if you create rules of procedure and then the board changes dramatically, or you find that there's projects that you want to review that you're not, or you find vice versa, that you're getting a lot of projects to review that really you don't need to review, you can amend your rules of procedure outside a town meeting. It's a planning board vote, and I think that that actually leaves more power over how your site plan reviews. You can fine-tune the process if you feel like it's too lenient or too onerous, without going to town meeting. And so that was the suggestion for staff. So that's why it says here, the planning board may, by a majority vote of the board, establish an administrative process for site plan review of certain site plan review applications. Pursuant to administrative review, the planning board may delegate to the town planner and/or to a designated board member the authority to, 1, determine whether a project constitutes a minor site plan, subject to Section 5-B sub 1, which you just did tonight, right, on Derby's Reed Shops. And if so, to waive site plan review therefore. And sub 2, conduct limited site plan review pursuant to new section, 4B6C. The planning board designee may refer any minor site plan or limited site plan review application to the planning board for its review in lieu of administrative review, if, in such designee's discretion, the scope of the project merits review by the board. In addition, any applicant may request site plan review by the planning board in lieu of an administrative review at the time of application, or any applicant aggrieved by a minor site plan or limited site plan review decision of the designee may reapply for site plan review by the planning board, and such review shall be considered a new application for site plan review, except that a separate fee shall not be required. So that's the framework that says you can decide what level of review, if any, you want to have handled administratively, and what you want to come before you at the planning board.
So let me ask a couple of questions on this. In looking at some of the tangible examples we had this evening where the application is basically for an alteration not affecting anything outside of the building, but the building itself is within a previously approved project that went through site plan review, and pretty much the parameters are established, and it's a question of really more compliance with the criteria, the parking table or what have you. That might be a trigger. On the one hand, I'm pretty comfortable with that. On the second one, where we're talking about limited site plan review, the limited site plan review is really, from what I can see in terms of some of the examples that we've been looking at and some of the smaller properties that have been up for development, which are typically residential properties. And not each, they might be in a zoning district, but they're not necessarily part of a site plan approval where the standards are set. My sense would be is that I think that it would be important for the planning board, if we want to streamline that, we could have a designated member of the planning board who's part of the screening process with staff, and then a recommendation could be made to the board relative, prior to a hearing, whether or not it would be administrative or whether it should go to the board. The reason I suggest that is that I think that the board, as elected members of the residents of the town, I think that wants to, our fiduciary responsibility to the folks who elected us was to basically be aware of what's coming in front of us. And I think it's important for the board to participate, or a member of the board, if it's a smaller series of projects, or if it's administratively more efficient. I think that accountability still needs to be there, but we could have flexibility in terms of the structure as to, does it, come in front of the whole board and then we decide it like tonight? Or do we do a preliminary screening where the board is a member of the board, a designee member of the board is present in the screening, and then there's that accountability. I just think that that's important in terms of what our fiduciary responsibility is under Chapter 40A.
So some of that mechanics of the nitty-gritty of how you decide what gets handled what is something that we would spell out in your planning board rules of procedure. That, if we get through this conversation, depending where the board lands tonight, we would work on that, and this board would be able to edit that and put in any type of conditions or structure that a majority of the board agrees upon. We felt that we didn't need to go to that level of detail in here. We wanted if the planning board chooses to say we're gonna delegate some authority, we wanted to put in here that you would do that and how you would do that. And so Gary's mentioned a couple times the limited site plan review, so if I could just quickly ask you to page within that same document towards the back, under Section 4-B, where we have, you'll see a page where there's some highlighted in yellow. It's still the same document. So the first section there's a inserted text, just reiterating that there'll be peer review on these site plan reviews. Section B there, that's the language that for now has the reduced thresholds, reducing 20,000 down to 5,000 square feet, and the land disturbance in areas of steep slope from 2,500 down to 1,000 square feet. There was, if you'll just bear with me to go through the language and then I'll stop talking. We added language in there that talks about these reduced thresholds, but then says, provided, however, that projects creating a disturbance or an alteration of drainage over an area greater than 5,000 but less than 20, so that would be that new delta, and greater than 1,000 square feet in areas of steep slope, but less than 2,500. So it would be that new subset of potential site plan reviews are eligible for limited site plan review as defined below. And Gary's 100% correct that this limited site plan review process, which is in sub E, basically just narrows the scope of the review, the submittal requirements to just simply the drainage, erosion control, and minimizing stormwater impacts to abutters. So it's saying that, now these may not all be residential. You could have a commercial property that's coming in to massage a riprap slope, and it's just all landscaping, right? It doesn't trigger a building permit because it's grading work. And so these, we've tried to spell out provisions. Now the board, in your administrative rules of procedure, if you choose to go that way, you could choose to figure out a mechanism to delegate some of these. They'll be purely technical, really. But the board doesn't have to. You could have them on your agenda. It's just that you wouldn't be going through every single site plan review criteria that you do for these large commercial properties. You're going to just be focusing on what's important: drainage, stormwater, impact to abutters.
And so, just to clarify, Gary, and again, not to get into the weeds here, because I agree that can be, but your suggestion, your suggested modification, Gary, is that everything comes before the full board, and then the full board decides whether it gets referred to an administrative review or to the full board. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I would agree, because I think that's part of our 40A responsibility.
Right. I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly.
Yeah.
So they may still be done by a designee and staff through an administrative process, but only by decision of the full board.
Exactly, and that's a filtering process.
And so that's something that we can certainly work, let's get through what's before us tonight, and duly noted, and we can have that conversation in the future, ideally.
Mary, can I ask you a question on the, looking at the map here? Maps are always helpful. And it's just the parameters of the delta. I like the idea of the 5,000, and then you're also putting in a secondary filter, which is 1,000 square feet if it's related to a certain gradient greater than 10%. So I like that. I'm wondering where did the 5,000? For example, why isn't it 3,000 or 4,000? I mean, I look at the map here and I see an awful lot of projects that are less than 5,000, sites that are a lot less than 5,000. I'm wondering what set up that filter? Was it a?
Well, it was trying to balance, really, what are we trying to address without, getting to the point where you're reviewing every single thing and someone wants to put a shed on a really small parcel downtown, and do we need to do limited site plan review for that? No, I don't think we do. 5,000 square feet was suggested. We have a bunch of problem properties that are about shortly over 6,000 square feet. So it's low enough to catch some of those really small properties that are the ones that we're really seeing turn over. And it's those smaller properties with these modest houses that don't have a lot of area. So when someone does buy it and they want to maximize their investment, they'll typically build as big of a structure as they can. And then once that house is built, they say, oh, where do I put my mechanicals in the setback? Oh, I think I need a variance. And oh, what do I do with my drainage now? And those are the sites that are really constrained. And sometimes those more constrained lots, it's not like having a 2-acre greenfield lot where you come in and build a house and it's easy peasy. There's a lot of, unexpected constraints, right, when you don't do your homework. Now, since you bring it up, I just want to really briefly for the board say to you, and for the record, what are we trying to mitigate by reducing the threshold for site plan review? And I think this gets to your question. These smaller construction projects are not subject to any review beyond building permit. If it triggers building permit, a big landscaping project might not or wouldn't. Hingham has very liberal allowances for size and scope of construction on non-conforming lots. That's fine. Many lots in town are constrained already by virtue of size, the presence of ledge or poorly drained soils, and septic systems. So it limits the building envelope even further. Many home builders do not focus on drainage design or erosion control efforts as they are building the residential structure. By the time the town realizes there's a problem, it's typically after the fact, and it's due to complaints from neighbors or residents regarding flooding of property or road flooding and icing, which is a public safety concern. Once these problems are identified, Randy would tell you that they are forever, or typically until the town fixes them or compels a solution through some mechanism. They don't go away, so it's an ongoing resource drain. It's more difficult and costly to remedy after the fact. Erosion controls on these sites are rarely installed or managed well without supervision. These projects burden the town resources from enforcement, public safety, snow removal, road maintenance, drainage maintenance, and they create unintended impacts to neighbors due to lack of oversight and review. In areas of very steep slope, greater than 10%, erosion and drainage impacts are concentrated and exacerbated due to the topography, and there's often a high incidence of ledge in these areas of steep slope. Combine this with a financial willingness to alter the entire area of a smaller lot to maximize the building size or yard area, and that leaves little ability to manage stormwater on site. We do not see this trend of reinvestment and demo revealed moderating, nor do we necessarily want to, until the market changes, and then possibly it may not moderate much even then due to the desirability of Hingham and the ability to pay demonstrated in this town. So aside from not changing the regulations at all, what can you do to try to lessen the impact of this kind of unregulated site construction on the town or the property owners? You could consider the limited site plan review, which we've started to talk about, and focus in on what's most important: erosion control, stormwater management. You could require that the application submitted for a limited site plan review have less burden of application than your full-blown ones. That would reduce the cost for the applicants. And we don't need all that other information for these targeted approaches. You could consider having the smallest of the projects handled with an administrative review by the planner and the peer review. These small projects are focused on technical details which either comply with the stormwater standards or they don't. It's not an arbitrary thing. So it's very straightforward for staff. They might be processed more quickly, which again would be beneficial to both the board, so you could focus on the more higher level reviews. It would be better for the homeowner who wouldn't be held up. Staff would respectfully say that this moderated approach provides the tools necessary to handle a problem that we see now and we don't see stopping for the town, while keeping the scope of the process and review at a lower level than full site plan review, which seems appropriate. It's a balancing act. This results in an appropriate design prior to construction being handled by the property owner, who's going to ultimately benefit from the reinvestment, as opposed to having the town resources overall dealing with the problems after the fact. And the cost of that, as you know, is borne through tax increases or your general budget. So really quickly, and I don't want to call people out point by point in this chart, but I've been asked, like, how big of a problem is this? I was on the phone with Chief and with Randy, was sitting in my office, and in a matter of 3 minutes, we came up with this list. So I put together a chart for you. They all kind of have different generation points, and I haven't done an exhaustive breakdown of all of them. So, and I definitely don't want to throw anyone under the bus here. But this just shows you that just off the top of our head, there's a number of problems. And have you been down Downer Ave lately? There's a section of sidewalk that's got horses on it. What are they called? Sawhorses. And it's closed because of it's iced up, so the kids can't walk down it to Foster School. That's a result of a residential, somebody graded their yard. It didn't trigger site plan review. Where does the water go now? Over the sidewalk and into the roadway. If there had been a limited scope site plan review required, potentially triggered by the area of disturbance, depending on how big that disturbance was, then there might have at least been an engineering review to say, that's great, but if you massage the grade this way, you won't be discharging into the public way. And those are the things that we're hoping to affect change on. And finally, your color pictures just at the very end. I just want to explain these to you since I did include them in your handout. This is another residential demo rebuild. I will say that the builder did put a dry well in the front yard to catch the gutter flow. It wasn't sized appropriately. What's happening is that the dry well is full. The first picture kind of shows how wet it is. The water comes out of the dry well, discharges over the yard, into the driveway, into the street, flows down the street, into that property that, you know, the next picture shows you the person downhill. It all flows down the street and the yard into her basement. And you can see there's a pipe right there on the edge of your picture. So the first house is discharging into the public way, creating a public safety and a big hazard. Goes down the hill, floods out the neighbor. The neighbor's pumping it out of her basement into her driveway, flows back out of her driveway, back into the street, creating a further icing issue. And then the final picture, you can see the ice in her driveway, and the final picture just shows you that the water and the icing is continuing down the side of the roadway. So I think I will be quiet now and take questions, but I wanted to try to frame the conversation for the board.
So I do have a couple. So as an initial matter, the obviously compliance with the, Randy sent an email today saying if we don't comply with the MS4 regulations, we're going to be run afoul of the EPA. I don't think anybody has a problem with the EPA, with the compliance there. I like how you phrased the review process, administrative review process, something we can work out internally. I do have some concerns here, a little bit about overregulation. And I'm worried we are really overregulating the process for a homeowner trying to put an addition on their house. And is whether or not this is narrowly tailored to achieve the compelling interest that we've been talking about with these problems. We've had Hatfield since the mid-1980s. I know because I lived in Bradley Woods and I was friends with the Hatfield family. We have had hundreds of thousands of additions put on this in the town, and now we're looking at 6 or 7 problems. And I think my initial concern here is it's a small fortune for someone to put an addition on in this town because we're so highly regulated.
It's a big fortune.
Right, big fortune. And now we're going to say to that person, hey, you've just paid $1,000 an architect, you've got a contractor. Oh yeah, now you got to buy, you got to pay for an engineer to make sure the drainage works properly. Oh, by the way, cough up some more dough for a peer review engineer for the planning board. I mean, is this narrowly tailored enough to address these concerns? Because these are bad issues, and I agree with that. These are problems. And if I was in a butter or neighbor and on one of these streets and this happened, I'd be very, very upset about that. But we have a remedy. and the remedy is enforcement. And this board has worked and talked about this cycle to beef up our enforcement provision. That's the remedy. And, we've talked about, hey, are we doing everything in this enforcement article to give the tools to our enforcement officer and town council, everything they can do to address violators? And we've been told we do. We've done that. So that's the remedy there. So I'm not completely against what we're trying to do here. I just want to make sure that we're not trying to kill the mosquito with a bazooka.
And that's a really good point.
And that's my concern.
If I can make a comment, so this is not, and we probably shouldn't necessarily have brought up Hatfield because this isn't really about
But it
Hatfield,
makes it unique.
but it
It's
does,
it is a good
if you
point.
compare the large lot coverage restrictions in other communities, we don't have that. I just want to make clear, this doesn't target building additions if it's really tied to site disturbance. So if you're coming in and you're doing a couple thousand square foot addition on your house, that still would not trigger this. If you're, it's about alteration of drainage patterns. Right, if you're filling in a ravine to put a building addition on, then you would trigger it, but that would be tied to the area of disturbance, not to the addition.
But
It-
so it could
you know.
it could be the slope or the area.
Correct, so currently, they come before us if they alter drainage patterns over 20,000 square feet. So that would be like your 172 Levitt Street, remember that one, or 9 Crooked Meadow. Those are kind of those big, large, re-landscape the entire yard kind of thing. Or alteration of more than 2,500 square feet in areas with greater than 10% slope. So you had, remember 42 Canterbury, they wanted to put that retaining wall, they have a bigger backyard. Well, you did approve it, yes.
When I think, now again, all weekend I'm trying to put this in context of who's going to be impacted by this. And I'm thinking slope, I'm thinking Bradley Park, I'm thinking maybe Thaxter Street. I'm thinking, these, and I'm trying to go, I was driving around town, I'm like, are those 10%? Harborview, right, Harborview. I'm like, are those 10%? I mean, are those the type of houses and homeowners we want to hammer financially? And I'm like, I don't think so. Now, again, the problems you're citing are problems, and they bother me that this has happened. But why aren't we whacking these people with our fines? Why aren't we going to court and getting injunctive relief against people? Because those are problems, and Randy's right. But now we're going to really financially hit hard folks who are trying to, work really hard to live in this town, to stay in this town, and they're trying to put a little modest addition on there, but because they live in a certain area, you're looking at paying thousands of dollars more for an engineer and a peer review engineer, where it's probably going to be fine and they don't need it. And like I said, thousands of additions have gone on in this town since 85. Thousands. And now all of a sudden we have like 6 problems, so we're gonna, again, go after the mosquito with the bazooka?
So this isn't about additions, I would just say. This is about alteration of drainage patterns. And really, I guess what staff is trying to say to you is that we have these challenges with these projects that are currently below threshold, and so they're not getting the scrutiny until it becomes after the fact. So really, it's board's discretion whether you modify the thresholds, whether you change them a little bit, but not as much as proposed, or you don't change them at all. That's a policy decision by this planning board. It's just staff's job to point out to you that we see this problem and we don't see this problem decreasing. So I guess the question is, do we take some steps now to try to intervene, or do we function in a reactive mode? And that's a policy decision. That's not a town planner decision.
So when I read the language of what you were proposing, and I tried to picture what that would mean as an applicant going in for an application, I was thinking that right now the current review process is a building permit process, which goes in front of the building inspector, and he reviews and his staff reviews the project for compliance with the building code issues. But what I'm understanding is in lots less than 20,000 square feet, that the site plan component of that isn't really required. There isn't really a review process for that. There is for septic, or Board of Health has a review for that kind of discharge. So when I initially looked at this, I was thinking, okay, that gives a filter, a review filter that would make sure that proactively the building department catches things, or has a mechanism to catch things before they're a problem. If they've just focused on the building and they haven't focused on the yard and the drainage and the site. That's how I originally saw this. But then now when I'm also thinking, balancing this, in a neighborhood where I live in the town, it's a lot flatter. There's a lot less going on in terms of drainage. But in the northern part of the town, there's a lot going on in terms of slopes and smaller lots on slopes. And so I'm hear you loud and clear, Bill, on what does this mean in terms of a hardship, not a hardship, cost, hardship to an owner who wants to do this. And does it mean, and I like to look at it in a tangible example, does it mean you would have to have an engineered site plan signed off by an engineer in addition to the drawings that are prepared by the designer or the architect? In order to comply, what would the compliance threshold on this be?
You'd have to pay the board's peer review engineer as well.
So then you'd have, and would you have to have somebody, how involved would the review process be? It's a good point.
So, I guess initially, right, this guy was walking through this over the weekend. I'm like, okay, so you got the architect, you got a surveyor. This is someone. I know you said it's not solely about addition, but let's talk about the addition situation, because that's what we see a lot in town. So you've got the architect, you've got the contractor, you've got the surveyor, and now you're told, hey, engineer for drainage and peer review engineer. The cost becomes enormous, and it's like, wow. I can just see someone coming in and being like,
the cost starts out as enormous, right?
It always, yeah,
right,
exactly. But it doesn't get any easier when you're talking about this greater regulation.
But if you're talking about the enforcement and injunctive relief and all of that, if there's a problem,
It's a problem.
that's not cheap either, right? And if that person's saying, well, you mean I could have spent $5,000 when I was designing it and not had this problem, and that now the town's coming back to me from an enforcement perspective, right? If the town has a choice between, it's back to the proactive versus reactive, right? I mean, if the town has a choice of encouraging people to think this stuff through, or just waiting and then going after enforcement, which is not really, I'm trying to talk it through with you, because I'm sympathetic
Yes,
to a lot of
I
what you
agree.
said.
And
right?
the vast majority of these projects will never be a problem.
I think that's probably right, but.
And the few ones that are a problem, and I agree with what you addressed, but the vast majority of people that we're going to now encumber with additional regulation, additional costs, are never going to be a problem. And again, I point to the thousands of additions that have been put on in this town. My parents being one of those people who put one on Bradley Woods house years ago. Don't know if it would have triggered this, but heck, my parents were middle-class people working really hard to get things. Extra costs for something that they didn't need, that bothers me.
I would like to say, I've been wrestling with this like Bill. I feel as though it's very burdensome, and I'm very sensitive to the cost. And I know that the MS4 permit, or I don't know if it's the permit, but the MS4 requires site plan review for an acre. And an acre is 43,560 square feet. And so when I think about, we're already more restrictive, right? We're already at 20,000 and 5,000 for slopes of 10%. So to me, to go below that again, it's substantially more onerous than the MS4 intends. Now I realize it's probably a national standard and every place is different, and certainly Hingham, has characteristics that could probably justify being at the 20 and the 5, but to me, it seems like a really big jump to go down from there, knowing the cost. I've been really wrestling with the cost issue too, and I know we're not just talking about additions, but I think once you put on a modest addition and maybe move your driveway or make your driveway bigger and do some landscaping, you can really easily hit those numbers, the 5,000 or the 1,000. And I live in Bradley Park, as you all know, but I think about Otis Hill, Bradley Park, a lot of the areas in northern Hingham where that number is ridiculously small, 1,000. I feel like, and I do think the cost is a factor. And so I look at it, I've been trying to think of it a little more globally in terms of, we clearly have identified a problem with the the drainage, and we're responsible as a town for managing our stormwater. So that's certainly something that needs to be done. I'm not sure that we have thought through what were all of the possible ways to address this. And I know you sent that email, Susan, that talked about our zoning context includes Hatfield, right? Like, we don't need to specifically discuss Hatfield, but that's our zoning context. And so as a result, it feels like we're trying to, as we always do, shoehorn everything in around Hatfield, because that's sort of what we're stuck with. But I'm not sure that this is the ideal way, I guess. And I'm not saying I have the ideal way to address this problem, but this just seems, to me, it feels onerous with these, and the numbers, is it 5? Is it 7,500? I mean, I don't know what the right number is, and I don't know that I have the data at this point to back up what the right number would be. Like, if the number were X, what problems would it have solved in the past 2 years? Or, or what do we think it would, I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like I have all of the information, I guess, that I need to resolve the burden that I see that this puts on the homeowner.
So, can I ask a couple of questions, Gordon? Would that be okay? Sure. So, Mary, is it contemplated that in the same way an applicant could request a waiver, so in forgetting about this Sec 4-B6, just under regular site plan review, in the same way that an applicant can request waiver of site plan review, and they kind of come in and say, this is what I'm thinking about doing, can I waive it? And the board may decide, or they may in some instances delegate that if they decide to proceed that, is a request for a waiver of either the site plan review the limited site plan review altogether, or a waiver of submittal requirements, all something that would still be available to applicants.
In the administrative rules of procedure, I don't see why the planning board, we have the waiver provision for the full ones, and that's, the board uses that discretion broadly. So.
Because there's the, sometimes it may be, it's, flat as a pancake. I put an addition on Bradley Woods. We had water in our basement, but that didn't change, with the addition. So that was many years ago. I don't live there anymore. So I don't, any interest in this personally, doesn't affect me personally, this bylaw one way or the other. But it might just be does the person the homeowner or the contractor just need hay bales to make sure the mud doesn't run into the street and end up into the storm drainer? So I think that there's an assumption that if there's 100 additions in a year, that there's 100 limited site plan reviews. But if there's a waiver ability, both for submissions and for the review itself, that may not be the case. I mean, like I said, I'm agnostic on this from a policy standpoint. I just want to speak to Bill on the enforcement. If there's no regulation for the development or whatever it is, the addition, the reconstruction, just the landscaping, then what is was the building commissioner enforcing under the zoning bylaw if someone were to complain about their neighbor? What is bringing an enforcement action for what violation?
Well, I mean, for example, some of the projects we looked at, if an individual creates a land disturbance that completely clogs up the drainage system, the town can't.
Okay, right. So that would
the
not.
town can't seek
So that
recourse
wouldn't be
against
under
that
the
person?
zoning bylaw, though. So the zoning bylaw enforcement mechanism can only be for a violation of the zoning bylaw. So the general bylaws of the town, which probably need some love and attention in the near future, have the general bylaws of the town. Under Article 10, which governs public ways and public lands, does have a Section 14, which is the discharge of liquids from a building. So it's not runoff off of your land. It's a discharge of liquids, I don't know, other than water, from a building that affects the sidewalk. So it doesn't even kind of get into the street. So if you're on a street and you don't have a sidewalk, I don't know that it applies. And it's only discharged from a building, so if you're saying maybe pumping your stormwater out of your basement or something. So it's very limited in its applicability. And there is a penalty. The first penalty is a warning. First offense is a warning. Second and subsequent offenses are $50. So, you know, it may just be that there are, as Jen said, different ways to get at it, and maybe they need to be looked at collectively. But there's nothing. If the answer is kind of wait and see if there's a problem, and then just address those properties after the fact, which is that kind of the situation the town is in now, then the kind of general bylaws and the enforcement abilities need to be beefed up, maybe from a general bylaw standpoint, so it's not just liquids discharged from a building that affect a sidewalk. It would have to be any water that's sheeting kind of, you know, from a property into any portion of the public way and creating a public nuisance or safety hazard. So, you know, and then the town might want to reconsider what the fines and process for that is as well. So, you know, it's just it's imperfect situation. There's no, I think, simple, you know, or there's no simple answer, and maybe it's more than one answer to addressing the problem. But, you know, I just say, you know, the question of, is every homeowner going to be hit with $5,000 in limited peer review costs? I mean, you know, that may be kind of an overstatement of the impact as well. So.
My question is, I mean, the enforcement provision I see does talk about site work improvement, which talks about, but not limited to roadways, parking lots, sidewalks, walkways, grading, landscaping, utilities, wastewater treatment, drainage, and other infrastructure improvements on the site.
Right, but it
So
has to be something that's already regulated. So if you're doing something that's unregulated, you can't be in violation of a regulation that doesn't exist.
But if you put an addition on your house and you cause a problem to drainage and other required infrastructure, landscaping issues, why wouldn't the enforcement officer be able to say, hey, you just caused a problem, and under this paragraph, I'm going to hit you.
You're on page 3?
I'm going to hit you with $300 a day.
What, are you on page 3?
Yes. Site work improvements.
So on this concept,
Let's finish this.
No, but that's under, wait a minute, that's under B. So this is under B, this is,
Apply for special permits.
this is a special permit.
page you on, Bill.
All right, so the special permit wouldn't apply. I'm under 3.
Yep, that's for a special permit.
So could we just go back for a minute? In the context, I think there are two context points here. One is an existing house that was built at a certain time under a certain bylaw's requirements. And that house is grandfathered from current requirements, with the exception of what you would do to change that house at this point in time, and then what would be done to the property would have to comply with today's bylaw. Now, the question that comes in is a pre-existing condition typically an addition onto an existing house doesn't usually exacerbate a site problem. However, if the house was built in 1945, for example, under a different bylaw, and there were much smaller setbacks and thereby a lot more coverage, there could have been a pre-existing problem. Now, if the homeowner comes in and wants to put an addition on, and now you have a situation where you have a new series of issues which could cause this kind of a drainage problem. I bring it up because it's probably a lot of them out there. How is that different than, let's say, another kind of a redevelopment of a site, which is essentially a tear down, where the whole site is being changed? So there's the context of this homeowner with a small addition versus a development site that's completely changed.
Totally.
But Gary, don't you think that the way the bylaw is written already, that site that's completely changed does trigger site plan review?
Oh, I would agree,
if they're
definitely.
disturbing the drainage,
I would
right?
agree that it should, and it does.
But it
Depending on the
does.
size of the lot.
Right.
I do
If
kind
it's
of
a smaller
agree
lot,
with you,
it
I
doesn't-
agree with what you're saying now.
Yeah, I mean,
I
can
mean,
you
you're
make a
right.
distinction?
I mean, who are we trying to,
Right.
who are we trying to impose the regulations on?
I mean, if it's
You know, like
if it's a project that's coming in
Right.
for a permit now, it has to comply with the current bylaw and then would comply with these standards. And we could.
Because it's not, mostly non-conforming.
And it's non-conforming,
Yeah,
and we could
non-conforming.
reduce the area so that it would exclude fewer of those properties.
Can I just say that, and I think Mary's map shows some of it. I mean, I do think that the Hatfield situation kind of exacerbates the situation. I mean, there's no question you're getting lot area coverage that is sometimes 50 to 80% of the lot. I mean, it's happening. You just have to live on Crow Point to see it. I can look on my back porch and point out 5 of them that are probably 75 to 80% of the lot coverage. And that's fine, and they can do that. But it's not just that. You could be in South Hingham and have a 2-acre site, but create a situation depending on the grades on your property where all of a sudden now all your water is running either into the street or whatever. So Hatfield is definitely going to exacerbate it. I think the majority of the cases probably are properties that fall under the Hatfield umbrella. But I don't think everything on that list that you and that Mary came today was necessarily Hatfield property. If you're on Crow Point where the lots are between anywhere from, I'd say 6,000, but you can have some that go up to 20 or 30,000, probably the majority of them are never going to get to 20,000 square, like the lot itself is never going to get to 20,000 square feet, so your disturbance is never going to get there. But, it's just a, matter maybe of quantifying better what the impact is, as opposed to kind of saying there is.
Or coverage at
yeah.
a certain point, because we're talking about disturbance, the way it's written now, I think the property in South Hingham that you described with the undulation and all of that, they would need to do significant regrading, and this might trigger that. But what you're describing in Crow Point is really a lot coverage issue that does affect drainage. And what we seem to be playing with here is just not really going straight at that point of lot coverage, and that's where I am uncomfortable with this. I am really curious why this list exists, Mary, without enforcement action against the property owners. But also we're shooting at numbers, but we're not really, we're just using the size as the trigger for all of this rather than the problem of lot coverage. Does that make sense, or am I?
Yeah, I understand the point that you're making. I mean, we're talking about areas of disturbance basically because that's the mechanism within our bylaw. So that's why we're talking about that. We didn't start out talking about lot coverage. This list here, I just typed up really quickly today. I'm not saying some of them are in different levels of discussion with different sections of the town, but I don't necessarily want to, go into the weeds on that today. I kind of put this together just to show you the range of lot sizes and, so areas, here's some lots that we currently have some drainage associated problems with. Here's the type of construction that was likely the trigger of that challenge. And then here's the, main impacts that we're sensing. I'm being silent on what else is going on about them. Some of them, there's other conversations. I just really put that together today to illustrate it for you.
I don't want to talk about each one of these properties individually. I'm just saying, to Bill's point about enforcement, is that the recourse you have right now is enforcement? If, a new house was built on your neighboring property and all of a sudden you have runoff coming across your sidewalk, what do you do about it, and does something happen?
If there's runoff across the sidewalk, that's an interaction with the town, right, because of the sidewalk. If there's runoff between two private properties, that's potentially a civil matter. So, and I'm not an attorney, I'm probably the only non-attorney in the room. So,
2 or 3 more.
Very, very lucky.
but what I would say to the board is, what I'm hearing from you is you're not comfortable modifying the thresholds. You feel like there might need to be more work done.
I'm also, I do think it's gonna be disproportionate. The impact of this is really gonna hurt North Hingham. And, you know, I hate to say it, but like, those are the folks I grew up with, those are the folks who elected me in this position, those are the folks I represent, and I do not wanna hurt them.
Whoa, you
Because-
represent this whole town.
I do, I
Okay,
do.
let's
but
start with
you're
that.
right, but
Okay.
I'm very mindful of that part of town.
Okay.
And
And that's the reduction on the grading.
because the
impact.
slope, because the
slopes,
slopes,
right.
that's where it's gonna end.
That piece in particular is a
In
is a
particular.
concern. The five-
And also
the
potential-
five-
and
5,000
we've
square
seen-
feet of disturbance.
Right, correct. But we have seen the Hatfield Amendment more taken advantage of in Crow Point, Bradley Park, Bradley Woods. But we don't see the slopes we don't see the big slopes in South Hingham. We don't see a lot of these problems, I think, but like I said,
Then, Bill, if there
the
is
vast
a
majority
problem-
of people that come in are never gonna be problems. If we need to, and again, all year long, I've been saying, what can we do with our enforcement article to go after violators? How can we beat this up? We were told, hey, we're good. We've covered a lot of ground. Let's increase the fines. I was ready to go further with it. If we need now to go further with it next year to now address drainage issues more, I'll take the lead on it. I'd rather do that, because I know that if I did something with my property and someone came to me with evidence that I caused a drainage problem, I would pay for it and I would fix it.
So is the board
You know, and
saying
I would,
you
and the
gotta
town
change
wouldn't
the
have to get a
threshold?
litigation. I would go and fix it.
Bill, I just give you one more example. There's a whole heck of a lot of flipping going on Crow Point right now, and the people buying those houses had nothing to do with how the houses were built, and those developers are coming in, slapping up houses, taking up the majority of the lots, and trying to do it as cheap a cut as possible. So, you know, it may not be that it's that. Listen, I was one of those people in Bradley Woods who puts on the addition. I'm with you, so I know how it is. But I don't think that on average that the issues are coming from the average homeowner who's lives in the house, is wanting to staying there for the next 20 years and wants to do it the right way. I think it's from the developers are coming in saying, I can buy a house not in good shape on Crow Point for $600,000 and flip it for $1.5 million to $2 million, which is what is actually happening. And they're in and out of there in 6 months. So, you know, but I hear, I mean, I'm not here, like I said, I'm not advocating or pushing these changes. I think what Mary and I are both trying to do is just try to lay out for the board the kind of the factual, what's really happening out there as the situation.
Condition. We're talking
Right.
about making permanent changes in response to what could be temporary market conditions, right? I mean, so.
Well, but there is this issue of
careful.
affecting others, right?
Yes.
That I think that we're about all the time, you know, and so I'm curious, Bill, like, how do you think about it strictly through enforcement?
Yeah. Because I think the
enforcement can be tough, you know?
It can.
But as
Well,
we
and
know,
it's costly
because
for the town. I mean,
we're trying to
It's-
enforce something
I
right
agree,
now.
but if we need to go back here and to amend it to now address drainage problems caused by site improvement or site construction, then we do it. I mean,
but what about
see-
the
see-
and we're looking at, you know, we just gave our zoning enforcement officer the ability to find someone 300 times a day.
I know, but
They have the ability to
They
do
sold the
that.
house already in the winter, and now the spring thaw.
Oh, you mean
comes, and the
so they
neighbor-
flip
and
it?
the neighbor's flooded.
Well, when you buy property, buy it as is.
That's 61
Sorry.
Abington. Somebody bought that house.
It's also one at Crow Point on your list too, that.
Yeah, there's a couple on the
And I'm
list that are,
thinking of
these demo
Section
rebuilds on these small ones are the flips for the most part. So I totally echo what Susan says. We're just trying to frame kind of the parameters of the challenges that we're facing. It's a policy decision on how we tackle them.
I certainly sense some reluctance, at least on a significant portion of the board, I think, about these changes. And these thresholds now, right? Today. I think it's true that the rest of the MS4 provisions, I think we have a high degree of comfort. But the threshold changes as described in here, I think is giving, I won't poll the board, but a significant portion of the board pause.
Could I ask this, Gordon, is the area metric or delta the one that's causing the largest problem, or is it the gradient? In other words, if it's the 10% slope, 1,000 square feet, or whatever the number is it the gradient? Would that be more of a reasonable one than the area?
Well, I think, not to speak for those colleagues that were concerned about it, I'll let you do it. I think in one sense, yes, but there's also a principle involved.
I thought of that.
Yeah.
Like, why don't we work with the gradient a little bit? But my concern is that the gradient causes the drainage issue.
It does.
Right? That's what it is. I mean, listen, hey, I looked at those examples over the weekend. I looked at them today. They bother me. And they bother me that the town is wasting financial resources and time, effort dealing with these folks. But again, I can tell you there's a lot of...
It's a small number.
Yeah,
by-
I mean, that's...
comparison.
So it's a tough vote for me, and that's where I'm at.
So
I'm
I'm
stuck.
going to pause for just a second. We have an incredibly patient guest and the incredibly patient members of advisory that may have questions or comments at this stage, and then we can kind of come back to our dialogue. I'll start with AdCom. Does anybody have comments, questions on the discussion thus far?
Yes, microphone, please.
Yeah, just come to the microphone, Eddie, if you would. Thanks.
My name is Andy McElhaney. I live at 26 Myers Farm Road, and I'm a member of the advisory committee. The concerns that I had were, first of all, all has to do with the number of square feet disturbance trigger, reducing the 20,000 to 5 and the 5,000 to 1. And one question I had was, would these actually address the problems that have been illustrated? For example, some of the lots on the list, the entire lot's only 6,000 square feet. So how do you disturb 5,000?
You demolish a structure and you build a brand new one, and they basically, they go right to the property line, like side to side.
Okay, so if you're satisfied that the regulation would pick up all of the problems that you have listed. That was my first question. Do they? Number one. Number two, the other question I had is, does it pull in non-problems? And Bill's concerned, and I don't even go so far as to putting on an addition. I was thinking of things like taking down trees, putting up trees. You can get to a 10-foot grade is fairly slight, but you can get to 1,000 square feet in no time. In fact, I was out measuring my driveway over the weekend because I have to repave my driveway. No, I need a new driveway, and I was thinking, whoa. Fortunately, it's a small driveway. But then I was also thinking, if it doesn't, which there's a catch basin right outside the driveway, if it doesn't drain from the driveway into the street, where does it go? So I don't know on some of these small lots, as Gary said, how would you remedy the problem if you can't drain it into the street? I don't even begin to know the answer to that. I mean, the only thing I can think of is a dry well type thing, but in any event, the other problem I had is, do these small disturbances really cause problems? do disturbances of as a 1,000 square foot disturbance cause a drainage problem? It sounds to me like it would be an insignificant disturbance, and does it really cause a problem? And that raises the concern I have that if you have sort of an officious intermeddler as a neighbor who doesn't like the aesthetics of what you plan to do by way of trees or fences or whatever, does that give the neighbor the opportunity to sort of create some mischief for you, having nothing to do with drainage? So these are the problems of an amateur the observer. So I'm happy that some of the thoughts of close to what you folks have said. But the final thing that I had to say is I had the same reaction as Bill to the laundry list of problem streets, that how can this continue without the town taking enforcement action? I assume that the discharge of water into a public way or into a navy yard is simply a public nuisance. And so you wouldn't need a regulation per se to go to court. You could go to court as eliminating the nuisance. But it does, and I don't know how, having said that, I don't know how you drain if you don't drain into a catch basin. I was brought up in the city, so I I don't know about grass drainage. But it does occur to me that if you don't have a bylaw that says you can't discharge, let's say, excess water into the street or onto your neighbor's property, then maybe that's a bylaw that ought to be added. I mean, that's the problem. And so maybe you start by saying you can't do this, and then work back from there. Thank you.
Gordon, I just respond to a couple of quick things. The first one is, so I'm kind of speaking, in addition to just talking zoning law with the board, also from the perspective of, the town's obligations with respect to the MS4 permit and that type of thing. So it's, as Jen mentioned, for regulation purposes, the threshold nationwide is an acre. But that doesn't change the fact that even if you had a whole bunch of small projects, even if they were less than 5,000 square feet, and they're in hilly areas and they clear the site because that's what happens, you do an addition, you don't just lose the grass there, the whole thing becomes a mud pit. And then all of that, mud, whatever it is, runs into the street, it's going into the storm drain. Cumulatively, the town is going to have to pay to clean those drains. So, there's aspects of it where the town does need to just try to address issues that are maybe kind of lesser than the federal threshold, and the question becomes for the town how to address it. So, there's going to be a cumulative impact issue. Typically with drainage, just generally to your question, is if you just have normal kind of sheeting, it's kind of like the town's roads. The town's roads may sheet kind of, and they go onto other people's property sometimes. That is not considered kind of creating a nuisance. It's when the flow gets to the point where it does, where it starts icing over or creating ponding or other kind of public safety type situations. So there are some common law protections just about normal, it's raining and your rain runs down your driveway or runs off the street and it ends up, on the abutters to the street. So, but I will say that, and kind of for as you said, the large majority of lawyers in the room, bringing an injunction action against somebody who has regraded or is, improperly draining is going to cost the town at the end of the day tens of thousands of dollars. Each enforcement action is going to cost the town tens of thousands of dollars. So, I mean, it's nice to say enforcement, but what they're finding across all departments that have enforcement rights in the town is sending a letter a warning if it doesn't do anything. If people are not inclined to say, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, or I didn't mean to do that, or okay, you caught me. If people aren't inclined from the get-go to make amends, then you can send them as many fines as you want, and they are not going to do anything till you sue them. So, like I said, it's not a simple answer. It's just not so simple to just sue somebody for town resources standpoint. So.
Other comments? Tom, you've been very patient. Come to the microphone if you would. Thanks.
Tom Patch. First of all, we have to understand that most of the northern part of town were on glacial drumlins. Most of the houses were built on those drumlins, and South Hingham doesn't have that real problem because it was mostly flat farmland. But we also have to remember that most of, essentially from High Street back towards South Hingham was developed under the more or less the current version of the subdivision control law. And as part of your obligation in looking at those projects, you looked at drainage. So drainage was in the mind of the developer at that time. And I'm not saying necessarily that it was a perfect thing, but it was on their mind. Drainage was not likely on the mind of anybody who was developing Otis Hill, Bradley Woods, a bunch of these projects are all pre-World War II. And that gets to my next point, which is having represented a lot of builders and developers and also done town council stuff, I can just tell you that most people, they're only going to deal with what they have to deal with. And if they don't have to deal with the drainage issue, they're not going to deal with the drainage issue. That means your builder, your excavator, that type of thing. I think the key here is to create something in place which causes those people to have to deal with it. And I hear what you're saying, Bill, but what I'm saying is if some threshold that forces them to put this into the calculus, that they look at this early on and they say, okay, are we going to cause these types of problems? It seems to me that there's the value of having something in place. To balance that, you could have a very liberal waiver standard at a threshold, so that basically what you're doing is you're forcing the issue, you're forcing the people to think of these things, and many of them may be minor, but all it takes is one of your kids to slip on a sidewalk that's all iced up, and it's a major issue for you. Now, for example, I'm not pointing out in particular, I don't want to point out, names, but down where we live, Bill, there's a house that, somebody's been doing a lot of work on, and they regraded the whole front yard, and all they needed to do, you know what I'm talking about, Judy. All they needed to do is put some mesh on it or something to stop the runoff. And I've even suggested to the person personally, but his comment was, I'm not getting paid to do that. So you got to sort of force them to deal with this, and a lot of this stuff could be very easily dealt with, and again, on a very liberal, waiver standard. And in terms of neighbor to neighbor, Susan can speak to this more than I can, but my understanding is we have the reasonable use doctrine in terms of nuisance in Massachusetts, which basically means you can drain water onto your neighbor's lawn or property, and even if it causes some level of harm, it's the idea of whether or not it's reasonable. And so I guess what you're not necessarily trying to fight, the town isn't necessarily trying to fight battles for individual disputes, but I think the key here is to force that issue to get into the minds of people so that they consider it right at the beginning, and so that they were not dealing with these problems down the road. So that would be my thought on that. Thank you.
That's I think very helpful, and I think consistent with a lot of what folks up here have said. So I don't think I agree with that. I don't think we're going to do that this evening, or in the coming weeks. It does sound like this is going to take a little bit more conversation, I would say, among the board to get comfortable on whether it is a change in those thresholds, or if we fortify the enforcement piece.
So with that,
Yeah, so.
Can I just-
I'm sorry.
well, no, can I just, since the pot's already swirling, I know, but we're already here, so I have to put this out there. This draft in front of you, so what I heard is the thresholds will come out and they'll remain as is. Those edits, the board is saying you don't want to change the thresholds. But let me ask you this. There is a provision in here for limited site plan review that was suggested for those new site plan reviews that are triggered by the areas of disturbance. So my question for the planning board is, now that you understand the limited site plan review is targeted, has a narrow focus, does the board have any appetite to leaving limited site plan review in as an option for those 4B6B reviews for disturbance and steep slopes? Or do you just want to take out this limited site plan review, take out the thresholds, and basically revert back? We'll just keep doing it the way we're doing it till we have further discussion.
I guess my sense is that I like having some kind of a proactive measure in there that allows us to deal with the problem, but also hearing Bill loud and clear about it can't be something that's going to put a real hardship on 90%, 95% of the properties in the town where people, it isn't a problem, or potentially they're going to take care of it anyway. I guess I like the idea of a proactive piece that doesn't leave us in a reactive mode. And if this is the way to do it flexibly, then maybe we could look at that.
So what Susan is passing down is language modified to eliminate the threshold language. Like, this is a draft that says, if I'm correct,
Yeah, I don't know if this can make it.
that if,
You're right, so what I did was, because Mary called me this afternoon and said, I know there's kind of some concerns that are being expressed, and the board may elect not to do it. Well, I didn't want, listen.
Here I thought you were clairvoyant.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. If the board was going to make the decision that it appears to be to say not to pursue the changes in 4B6B this year, and then the board we were going to have to sit here and go through and say, what do we change in this in order to get the board to a position that it might vote tonight? I figured I'd do that work in advance. So if you flip through, and it's in green, if you flip through anything that's highlighted in green, which is just in 5C, so 1I 5C, and then if you flip to the back to 4B6, the items marked in green the changes marked in green would be eliminated, but it would retain all the MS4 provisions, and it would preserve, if the board is in favor, setting up the administrative process for minor site plan reviews, which is the internal only, or whatever the board might designate. So it really just eliminates the changes to the 4B6 trigger thresholds and the accompanying limited site plan review provisions.
So I'm looking at the threshold
Yep.
here on paragraph 6.
B, yeah, it would go back to the
Yeah.
20 and
6 Bravo. So
2500.
it would go back 2500.
Right.
So what you crossed out would go back.
Yep.
And the green would all be eliminated.
And all the green would come out, and then it would go back to, there's some, other changes in here, but they're all related either to just kind of the minor site plan review, which is 1I, or there's some MS4, and then there's some just kind of cleanup.
there's a couple of corrections that
Corrections,
Eagle Eye
cleanup.
Susan caught.
Like I
and
found a random word in a sentence that I'm like, oh, look, here's a random word that doesn't belong in the sentence. Why don't we clean it up? So they're just some miscellaneous things. But the substance of what's left is all the MS4 and the and the minor site plan review with, administrative review process for minor site plan
So the
review.
administrative language would be helpful, I think, as a tool for the board, so that you can really lay out which of the things like we had on tonight's agenda, are you comfortable just having handled in the office or not? And you don't,
And we still have the opportunity to discuss Jerry's original point that at least the full board decides what gets
Yeah, the
referred to
filters, the board
administrative.
still filters. the
We still have
projects.
that
that's a
opportunity down the
discussion
road.
for
Right.
another date with your rules and regulations.
Because you could elect to never delegate. I
You-
mean, this is, you may set up the process, and if you set up the process and for whatever reason, this board or a future board thinks they should do it all, they could kind of take it back. I mean, it would be wholly within the control of the planning board.
It just gives you the option, and it doesn't have to go to town meeting, so you can change it on a whim. Well, not really.
Should we read through all of this?
So you
Well,
have read through all of this at previous
The last
meetings?
time, right?
We've gone through all of this language in public hearings. So my sense, not being an attorney, would be that if the board was comfortable moving forward with the language as revised, excluding the changes to the limited site plan review and the thresholds, that you would make a motion to approve the language as revised and cite this,
What we could do,
you know?
I mean, because there were those couple of things, like the cleanup things we caught, we could flip through and say, you know, this is no change from the original draft, right? So some things were in the original warrant article you sent up to the Board of Selectmen, and some things have evolved over the last month.
And that would be helpful.
Okay.
We've had a great conversation, but we've been going on for a little while, and I'm not as clear as I was when we first started, so
So on page
it'd be nice to go through it all, so we know what we're looking at.
On page 2,
We're going through your,
this one with the
markup
green.
today.
Yeah, this one with the green. On page 2, the change at the top of the page was in the original. There's no change there. On 1H, this is the administrative review. In the original warrant article, it was here, but it's now just being relocated. And
Just so I understand the blue edit. The blue edit was proposed to be added and now is deleted, or was originally there and was deleted?
okay, so it depends on the provision. So at the top of the page, and that's in 1F, that's in the existing bylaw, and it's proposed to be deleted. And that was in your original warrant article.
Okay.
The second one in 1H is new language that was proposed in the warrant article, but is now proposed to be in a different section. So it will just revert to what the existing zoning bylaw says under 1H.
Okay, that's good to know.
All right, under 1I, yes, 2. The substance of this was in the warrant article, but it's just been refined during the hearing process.
And the intent of that change is just to bring our procedures and our submittal requirements more in line with what we do today. So we've been wordsmithing who gets how many copies and how. Originally, we had suggested that some of that burden get shifted to staff to distribute some of the information, but upon further consultation, it's reverted back to having the applicant have the burden of that.
So then you flip, and then the next one is the submittal requirements, and this is where you'll see in the side comments that these are from Mary originally, and then I kind of joined it a little later in the process of working with the MS4 consultant. These are additional submittal requirements that will assist the town in complying with the MS4 requirements from the EPA. So that's in F, H, and I.
So you're in
I'm on, right, so Section 4, submittal requirements, it's the 4th page of your package. And where F, H, and I are your submittal requirements. And you know, some of it was, this was already substantively in your warrant article. It's just been, again, a little bit reworked during the course, refined during the course of the hearings. In section 5 used to just be one paragraph. I recommended to Mary, just for clarity, because the other subsections have titles. For example, 4 says submittal requirement. 5 didn't have a title. So the recommendation is to add a title to say this is what section 5 covers, and then break it down into the parts. So A is waivers, B is what is a minor site plan, and then C is the new administrative process that Mary's proposed, minus the language highlighted in green.
So the section C, that was not in your original warrant
Right,
article.
that is new.
Okay, that's new.
Section 6, so this is the little highlighted in yellow. This is the random word that we just found, so we said, why don't we clean it up? The inspections during construction, that was inserted in the warrant article, but is being moved to later in the section, so that's why it's shown as deleted here. And then when you get, this is now the review criteria, and as you'll see from the marginal comments, all of these, so in E, G, and H, those are all related to MS4 compliance. This pre-construction review meeting is still in here, it's just been relocated. So that was added in the original warrant article, but will be removed and relocated in the new version that Mary is going to, and I are going to put together. So,
Yes.
So now what's been created is in a new section 8 for conditions of approval. All of these 3 items, pre-construction meeting, inspections, and as-built plan requirement, were all in the original warrant article, just in a different form, and now they've just been relocated in a subsection that was more appropriate to consolidate them together, and then they were refined during the hearing process. And those are all MS4 related requirements. So that's section 1I, and then when you flip a couple of pages, you're in 4B. In 4B6, when looking at kind of the peer review sections and how they're cross-referenced across the bylaw for different types of applications, it was kind of inferred but not express that site plan review would apply for, peer review would apply for 4B6 site plan review. But if a project came in and all it triggered was 4B6, there's nothing in 4B6 that references the peer review. So in order to make it consistent across the bylaw, this is something that I recommended to Mary last week that might be worth making it clear. Then there would be no changes in 6B. All those changes in 6B would be removed. 6C is came about as part of discussions with the MS4 consultant that project. So this is if someone attempts to segment a project in order to stay underneath the threshold. This would not allow someone to segment. So if they tried to do, 4 10,000 square foot projects as opposed to one 1 acre project, this would this would not allow kind of the segmentation to avoid the regulation. And then the exemptions used to be just kind of a run-on from subsection B, and we thought it made sense to kind of break them out and just kind of, make the bylaw read more clearly. The new exemption 6 is also an MS4 recommendation from the consultant to say that road widening and improvement projects aren't triggering site plan review provided that certain road widening projects of a certain scope, as long as they comply with the MS4 permit. And the MS4 permit is administered by DPW. They do the roads. It just kind of made sense. But it's almost like well, if that's what we're doing anyway, why do we need to put it in the regulation? And it's because our MS4 permit says it has to be somewhere in a regulation, that the town will comply with the permit for road projects. So that's why it's there. And then E will not be included, and that is the end.
Susan, thank you for making that clear.
Always good to have a backup plan.
It's always good to have a backup plan.
Well,
Especially with us.
it saved us from having to do it on the fly this evening, so.
I think I am ready for a motion.
I would make a motion, we act favorably on Article EEE, version 2, as amended and discussed tonight.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Yeah, there you have it. One in a row. So, let's go ahead and return to the agenda. See if we can dispense with Article B.B.B, Section 3, A, the retail sale of alcoholic beverages. There's been a fair amount of discussion on this at a number of meetings, including extensively on the 13th. That, as I recall, limited it a bit. I don't know if Mary and Susan want to walk through where we ended up with that conversation.
So the board has in front of you a layout, and you're right, Gordon, at the last meeting, the board spent quite a bit of time discussing the proposed problem that the board is looking to mitigate with this regulation. And really what it came down to was that it was about parking, traffic, circulation on the site. And so you'll recall that when we started this, originally it was proposed to be an A2 in all of the zoning districts, I'm sorry. And we had the conversation about why are we doing an A2? Really from the zoning board's perspective, perhaps a retail use is very similar to a retail sale of alcohol. And so the suggestion at the last meeting, which was on point, was that if the board considered changing that A2 for retail sale of alcoholic beverages within the business A and the business B zones, and you left it as a permitted use, by virtue of it being its own use in your use table and your regulations, you don't have a corresponding parking requirement in your parking requirement table. So your regulations already say, if you don't have a parking requirement in your table, or you want to do more or less than the parking requirement that's listed, you need a special permit A3. What does special permit A3 get you? It gets you a site plan review, and then you can talk about parking and circulation. And you can have your duly noticed public hearing with your neighbor input and notice. And that was another thing that the board was interested in having. So the proposal that's in front of you tonight is proposing to have the retail sale of alcoholic beverages as a permitted use in business A and B, and it's leaving it as an A2 in waterfront business, which is not a change from retail uses or what it was before. And we further discussed the fact that the planning board did, it's not in red in the copy that's in front of you, but in section 4.17, you did insert 4.18 in the use table, and that was in acknowledgement of the fact that the planning board did not intend to eliminate the retail sale of alcoholic beverages from the shopping centers, such as the Derby Street shops, or perhaps if there's another shopping center in the industrial or industrial park area. So there's those two changes. And the last page of your handout, we further discussed the parking table, and in an effort to clarify the language, the proposal is made to add the word store after the word retail in the parking requirement table under uses, and that is essentially to have to make it clear that it's retail store, that corresponds with your retail category in your use table, and it doesn't relate to this retail sale of alcoholic beverages. And so that's where we are now.
And at some point, it would be interesting to consider, if we have a use that is seen a lot in town, to create a requirement so that it was clear to the person proposing the use what the parking would be required.
So we are happy to have that conversation. You might recall that staff drafted that for you 2 years ago, and I'm happy to dust it off and do more work on it if the board wants to. That's a great conversation.
Oh, I remember.
It
was extensive. It wasn't.
Didn't Jeff Durkis with that at the time?
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's I'm happy if we want to have that on the list for next year. We have a good foundation for that conversation. You'll recall that the balancing act is when you put the uses in the table, then you don't have special permit A3s necessarily. So that if there are uses that this board feels that you want to see when they come in, you would not have them in that table. But that's for another day.
Table where you meet this, or there could be uses that may always require an 8.3. So you could, rather than just by omission do it, say these types of uses may trigger different parking requirements for different parking demands depending on location or type and require an A3. So there's a couple different ways you could approach it.
The nice thing about the omission approach is that it's all encompassing. So if a use comes that you hadn't thought of, and it's not in your table. But in any event, that's a whole, I totally agree, and we can circle back next year if the board wants. So Susan identified, proving that we can never be done looking at these. She identified a couple of changes.
I mean, you know what the thing is, when you read these so many times, you read them the way you think they say, and then you realize it doesn't actually say what you think it says. So, anyway.
So if the board, after public comment, if you're ready to act, it would be a motion to advance as revised.
Questions or comments?
I think it answered my earlier concern, which was making the the liquor store establishments non-conforming in all the business districts, which would have put a hardship on them.
Right. Right. Comments? Advisory? Mr. Haskell?
Thanks. My name's Eric Haskell. I'm with the advisory committee. I have just 2 or 3 questions about this. First of all, where this article speaks about retail sale of alcoholic beverages, we're talking about package stores, right? So off-premises consumption? Yes. Okay. And I ask that because, in the alcoholic beverages licensing world, retail is a term of art that includes both off and on-premises consumption. And so I want to make sure that the intent of this is not to regulate bars or just package stores. Great. How would this interact with 4.25 of the use table, the accessory use of another building up to, I think, 15% of floor space? So 4.25 permits retail, consumer service, or commercial service as an accessory use up to 15% of the floor area in any single building, where consumer service and commercial service are defined terms, but retail isn't. So how does this interact with 4.25?
I'm not convinced that would be retail sale of alcohol, but it's retail sale of alcoholic beverages is business A and B and waterfront recreation unless it's permitted as part of a shopping center. So
this use in 4.2.5, if you look at where it's prohibited versus where there's an A2 required, this is really, for example, in an office park. So if you had an office building that has a lobby shop or a dry cleaner or that type of, so that's what, when it's talking 15% GFA in any single building. So if you look at those uses, office park, industrial park, limited industrial park, it's really an accessory to the main use of the building, for example, an office building type use that would have a lobby shop.
But to your point, Eric, I think we tried on that last page of the parking to add the word store to
Right.
retail to make it clear that it was retail store. And on 4.25, should that say retail store in the ideal world?
Where is the use? Is it 4.1? It's 4.1.
Well, 4.1
Is retail store.
is retail store whole thing, right? This is
Right, so it,
as
right.
an accessory
10 to 4.25
use.
Yeah, right, but the name, I'm going to the name. So
Yes.
that's right. So it's the same reason why store was inserted in Article 5 was for that same clarification that I think that Eric's
Right.
referring to and you're referring
So,
to.
and then retail store says, other than those specified elsewhere on the schedule, so now 4.18, we're specifying alcohol as a separate.
Right.
So by virtue of not being listed in 4.25, it wouldn't be allowed in those, meaning alcoholic.
Right, because alcohol, retail sale of alcohol is now its own specified commercial use, so it's not included in 4.25, it seems to me, and I'm not an attorney.
That's a caveat, everybody.
I would say if the board wanted to err on the side of clarification and specificity as you did in 5A, then you could insert the word store into 4.2.5 and it would eliminate any dueling interpretation that the building commissioner or the ZBA would have to make.
I think that addition of that word store was an improvement to that section and may very well be an improvement to
Unless there's
4.25.
no- Unless the board doesn't think that if an office building wanted to have a liquor store or lobby shop that sold beer would be a problem, right? So we're talking about 15% of a commercial industrial building where they're providing likely services to employees or guests of
So being
the.
devil's advocate, I worked at Line in Hartford for a while, and it was a liquor manufacturer, wholesaler. But they actually had a little store where employees could, after hours, buy some of their stuff. Now, it wasn't open to the public, it was only open to employees. So that's different than a retail store where members of the public can come in.
And for what it's worth, my understanding from Emily, I'm not personally familiar with this use, but my understanding from Emily is that there is an outfit in the industrial park. I think it's a distillery or a brewery that dedicates a portion of his space to retail sales of his product under 4.25.
Oh,
That's the vodka place.
that's good to know about. We should
So therefore, the question is, if you leave it retail, is it any type of retail?
Or did we just, because 4.1 says a retail store and then says except specified elsewhere, and now we are specifying elsewhere, are we putting all that business out of compliance?
Well, I guess this is where it just says retail, it doesn't say retail store. I think if you put retail store, you're now making it a pre-existing non-conforming use. I don't know if you just leave it retail, the
That it
interpretation could be any uses that involve retail.
It's interesting because under topics, we have retail groups, retail stores, and retail, marine. Now, I guess we would also be adding retail, alcohol to that list. And we don't have a definition of retail.
I mean, the other thing to do is you could you can leave it the way it is, which I think leaves it arguably open to any type of retail because doesn't say retail store. Or you could go the other direction, which is retail store, retail sale of alcoholic beverages, and you just make it longer and you add it in. And then you eliminate the debate.
One was to retail sale of alcoholic beverages.
Like add the language to make it clear. So that would be an item 4 to amend 3A 4, or I would change the order, Mary, just so that it's like numerically in order. So that would be 3 and 3 would become 4. So it would be amending 3A 4.2.5 by replacing the word retail with retail store, comma, retail sale of alcoholic beverages.
And that covers it.
Good catch, Eric.
And then my last question has to do with the shipyard, which I understand is one big special permit under Section 4-G, where package stores are one of the permitted retail uses under that special permit. Would this article have any effect on the shipyard at all?
This would not affect the shipyard because in addition to all the listed uses, the shipyard allows the zoning board to allow other uses. So the language of the shipyard, well, I wouldn't call it the shipyard, it's the mixed use and industrial district bylaw, the list of uses, and hopefully my memory is correct on this one. What section are we in? 4G. It's long. It already has liquor stores in here. Number 1, as a listed commercial option. And then in addition, it says uses not listed may be permitted as part of the originally approved final plan if in the judgment of the board it doesn't create health, traffic, or safety problems. Or it may be permitted as an amendment. So the zoning board has pretty wide latitude to let anything they want into the shipyard for the most part.
This new 4.1A
Yeah.
just won't affect that.
Won't, no.
It won't affect that at
No.
all. Great. All right, that's all I have.
But you made me think about the grocery stores that sell alcohol, and I think those are all covered by
The shopping center.
By the shopping
Yeah.
center, which is 4.17. Yeah.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Other comments? So with those changes, I'll entertain a motion to recommend the language as revised this evening.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Downtown Hingham Overlay District, Article D. So we had a really excellent, I think, conversation the other night about this. There's been some revised language that we'll go through. You know, this ultimately boiled down to a roof deck conversation ultimately, which was more or less spurred by some of the activity downtown and really what the kind of visual impacts and follow-on consequences of roof decks are to abutters and the broader community. So we'll go through all this, but I think, you know, the question of whether roof decks really belong in the downtown historic district, I think, is a sort of a threshold question for us, right? So as we talked about, some folks had roof decks in the south end when you're, you know, 7 flights of stairs up and no way to get outside, so you get to have a roof deck, right? That's a very different scenario than we have downtown, and you know, it's different than having a roof deck somewhere where, you know, it's not nearly as dense as downtown. My guess is that this conversation probably has sparked some interest in folks that may or may not have thought that it was even possible to have roof decks downtown prior to this. So I think we need to do something. I think we need to be pretty conservative and kind of work from there. So I don't know if other folks have.
Well, what was the result of your thinking? The upshot, where'd you land?
Well, I guess where I'm landing, shall we say, is that the public use of roof decks are the things that trigger the larger access points and a lot of the complicating factors, right? So limiting the use to that one top floor, right, that will have hatch access or what have you, and then we can set whatever the boundaries are for the setbacks and for the rails and that kind of thing relative to building code. Would allow them in residences that wanted them on the top floor, but also not create some of the sort of the visual disturbances that I think we were struggling with on the 13th. So that's where I'm leaning.
If I could follow on that, Gordon, you know, I was thinking about this and looking at what other communities are doing, and I agree that there's the Beacon Hill precedent and there's the South End precedent, which I think is a very different precedent than where we are, just in terms of architecturally and in terms of the scale of the buildings. When I think of roof decks and I think of Nantucket and I think of Martha's Vineyard or something like that, I think of a widow's walk. And a widow's walk is a private piece that's limited only to that structure. And so I'm thinking, what I was most troubled about with the recent roof deck adventure we had downtown is that a public roof deck really requires another story of appurtenances to get up there. Right. Two stairs and an elevator shaft. So it basically is de facto another story, no matter how you slice the onion on it in terms of whether it's a floor or not. And I just think that in looking at downtown, it's very narrow, and you know, in terms of the width of the streetscape, and there are adjacent residential communities on either side of the district, all of which are 2 stories or 2.5 stories or 1.5 stories. And you have a 3-story building with a roof deck on it, and now everybody's looking down into the residential areas. It just seemed to me that I like your idea of the private roof deck rather than the public. I think it solves a lot of problems.
I mean, short of prohibiting it completely, right? I mean, that's certainly an option, I suppose, as well.
I landed in a similar place, and I think the one additional thing that I thought was, you know, if it's a single-family house, I would just allow, you know, it just didn't seem like there's a problem with roof decks in single-family homes. It's really in multi-use or multi-family structures where we get this. So you would go to the special permit route, and there couldn't be any of the elevator shafts.
Right, and mechanicals.
And that would just solve, and then I don't even
stairways
think
and
we'd
all of
need
that.
to go into a lot of very specifics about the dimensional requirements or anything like that, because we have HDC doing design review, so we could say, you know, our intent is that this not disturb the neighbor's privacy, that this not be a visual blight, you know, whatever the intent is, and then just let them
Do their thing.
because every building is so different. I think it just gets difficult to.
What about the overlay outside the district? Is that a concern?
Oh, because we've added to the.
We've added they can. Yeah,
They
but
do the advisory
We've added
review.
design
in the-
review. Now it's only
the
in
overlay.
case
but
of a
let's think
special
about how that play
permit.
out, right.
So that's why a roof
So
deck
if-
would require a special permit.
So we
So
get the
then,
A2.
But it's only
So it'd be an A
private,
special
yeah.
permit A2, and would would the district commission still weigh in, and they would,
Yeah.
I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
And don't
And it would
forget, you
say-
did have a residential roof deck in Crow Point that did create a problem.
That's right.
On a single-family residential house,
but then
where we
the
had a
zoning was
conversation about
changed.
projections.
Right, but then the zoning was changed.
Correct, well, I'm
So you're
just
trying to
bringing that
address
up
it.
where,
Right, right.
just only to the counterpoint to residential roof decks are not a problematic. You have had one notable example where the neighbors didn't like it.
How many stories was that one? 4 stories?
I don't recall. So,
With the.
I know, it was a new high-rise.
so I mean, I guess my point is that
we should just leave it.
you give an inch, there's always a mile taken. If the board is concerned about impacts, you might want to have the A2 option. But if you want to exempt residential properties, so be it. I mean,
Yeah, I'm not, I just thought that would be one way to because I'm
What-
always looking for
Yeah.
simpler rather than more complicated.
What about
so-
your concern, though, about the residential one, Judy, where like, you said you don't want a neighbor kind of like looking down,
Well, right.
partying up there looking down?
Right,
Yeah,
and because,
Concern.
and, you know,
Yeah.
and because this area is so dense, maybe just treat all the buildings the same downtown and make it, you know, so that they're only private roof decks, there's no public access through these elevator shafts. And we just express what we're trying to achieve.
so would you want to, I've heard two different things, and I just want to understand with regard to having a hatch only. It sounds to me like you're talking about
Or internal staring.
on page 3 where it says sub 1, C sub 1, height, and then it says access. And this talks about how do you get onto your roof deck. So A is if you have a 3-story building, it can only be from the internal hatchway. B says if your building is 2.5 stories or less with a sloped roof, the roof deck may be accessed from enclosed habitable space on the half-story level. So right now, C speaks.
So that could actually be a public roof deck, because that could be a building that was built that way.
That's
and-
within the roof form. and
Yeah.
it's about chat
Yeah.
and right here.
Yeah, I mean, we could put language in there that says the access must be from enclosed habitable space within the roof form, or,
We're doing
and then,
Well, could you want to put it in, can may be accessed either by roof hatch or, so it doesn't have to be within the roof form?
either by roof hatch or enclosed habitable space within the roof form.
But it would have to be private, though, private habitable space.
I mean, if you entered the roof deck,
Numbers of, if it's public, you have 2 means of egress and it has to be handicapped accessible.
Right, but if it's in the roof form, they could have an elevator that's opening up onto it.
yeah, I mean, ultimately, you're not gonna really see these as retrofits. They're gonna be from new development or assemblages, you know, and either a really big mansion or a mixed-use commercial residential property. Or someone's garage, as we discussed last time. But C is the one that I think presents the most challenge with regard to potential staircase and elevator overrun. This is for your buildings that might be 1 story in height, so it says 2 stories or less. It may be accessed by access structures not to exceed the minimum access requirements of the state building code. So C right now actually opens the door to allow those appurtenant structures that this board found to be the most objectionable. And they would be on a 1-story building, so they'd be extremely visible.
Exactly.
So if that's the thing that
That's
this
the one I
board,
was struggling with, right.
so if you don't like that and you
would
don't
just
want to
strike
see
it.
that, then you should strike C or edit it.
Well, couldn't we just take the 3rd story idea out of A? If a proposed roof deck is on a roof with no habitable space, right, then access shall be limited to this. And then B is if it's on coming off of a half level.
Right.
Well, I think A came from your thoughts, Judy, and obviously other board members, that if they're already at the maximum height, by limiting it to roof hatch, it had to be tied to the internal to that space from which the hatch was coming, and now you're not really turning it into a public fourth story of use, right? I think that was, am I paraphrasing you fairly?
No, that's good.
Right, so I think that's why we drafted it to call out, if you're already at 3 stories, this is all it could be, kind of saying you're capped off, and you can have kind of, yes, and you can have your own little private parties, but you're not having a big public to do. And then, you know, that's why maybe it makes sense for anything less than 3. That's kind of why we broke it down that way. I
So
don't know if
anything
that's
less than 3, you can have the roof deck, but you have to be able to access it either from a hatch or from a habitable space.
Right.
So for
And then
buildings.
you don't need C.
Yeah, then you don't need C, 'cause that
At all,
covered everything.
right, and then you never end up with a situation, any building in the downtown that just has those 8-10 foot
Right.
tall things popping out the top,
Right.
which was the Lincoln Building dilemma.
So that was one of the, Gordon, can I just walk you through the changes? Would that be helpful?
there, sure.
Or did you have?
No.
Okay. Just to flip back to the first page, there was one new objective that we've talked about a couple of times. There was no change to that.
the word 2 on the. Well, can I just go back? I'm just wondering if on that one, it's really just about access, so I don't know that it goes to height. So maybe that subsection only needs to be entitled access?
I think height got in there because we were trying to think about it from scale of the buildings.
Right.
And that's where I think height came in, but
Right, but I don't know.
It's not
that-
descriptive.
It's not like you're, right, it's all about access, that
That's about
section,
access.
so that could just be access, okay.
So on the first page, that language was in the original
Oh,
article.
so you're starting from the beginning?
The beginning.
Yeah.
I would just take out the word 2 on F, just because the other ones don't have it.
Right.
So we're gonna strike the word "to." And then the next section has been massaged.
Thank you.
Now we're in C, right?
Now we're in C. And so this reflects the changes made at the last meeting. And I would just tell you what has changed since the last meeting is I deleted what you told us to. But going down to sub 2 with the roof deck, and this gets to some comments from Emily Wentworth, and I was talking with Andrea about this today. Last meeting, the board said the roof deck shall not be visible from, and they said a public way. Building code requires the minimum barrier or minimum guardrail to be 36 inches. Mike Clancy said 36.
Oh, that's interesting.
In an email today from the zoning administrator. Of course, the board can certainly set this at whatever you like.
I would check it, it's typically 42. I mean, I'm just thinking, given that it's high above the street.
So one thing that was suggested was the roof, do you want just the roof deck to not be visible from the public way? Or do you want the roof deck and this barrier guardrail to not be visible from the public way? Because as a practical matter, the roof deck is really as defined. It's that flat decking on the ground. What you're gonna see is the railing that goes around it, right? So
This is the section where I would say the roof deck, you know, should be constructed in a way that preserves the abutting property's privacy and the exterior aesthetics of the building.
And leave it at that.
And leave it at that, and have the HDC say, you know what, you should really put your fence over there because you can see it from here, or, you know.
Well, then I would suggest that maybe that language goes in section 2, the objectives, right, where the objective is, you know, maybe related to,
Well, we already said preserved.
Well, the
And/or
objectives of
complement.
2 are for the whole overlay district,
Yeah.
not just as relates to
yeah,
roof decks.
okay.
I mean, but I know what you're getting at, Susan.
I mean,
just
it's
don't
kind of
know.
hard to get, when you get a little bit squishy in requirements, like what
feels
does
hard
that
to interpret,
mean?
Right, so
Right.
from the one here that has to try to tell Joe applicant what is the planning board, it's easier for me to say, show us your perspective view of your building with your roof deck, and on your perspective view, show where the guardrail is, and show if it's visible from across the street standing on the sidewalk.
I mean, if
You know.
it works in Boston, that's how Boston does it.
Well, I
I
think
mean,
Boston is Boston's more prescriptive of,
Well, they said
you
it-
can't see it from X and it
Well,
can't be.
I think, well, Andrew said this to me, Bill, said they require the applicant to
I like
stage
the mock-ups, yeah.
mock-up.
Oh, no
put
question, I would.
mock-ups in here, Bill. I put
Yeah,
I would,
and
I would
then kinda go
definitely,
down there and
I would
look.
definitely do the mock-ups, but I would put a setback requirement on it, because if you don't, it's gonna be out flush on the face of the building, and
But then you would see it.
then you'd see it, but.
But then if you'd see it, you'd be
Then
caught
it
with the
wouldn't be
mock-ups.
okay.
So the not visible from the public way.
I think is the,
I felt like that was the balance. We
Yeah.
started to
Right.
get into like how many feet back, and it was so
Right,
prescriptive,
right.
and we thought, well, all the buildings are such different sizes and different heights, so why don't we just say we don't want to see it from the street? And I do think that the counterpoint to just saying, just make it nice, basically, is that applicants, they do want more guidance, right? They don't want to come in spitballing and have HCC,
Yeah.
squash it. So I would be inclined to leave some version of this. You can't see it
leave
from
in
the
the story
street.
poles and make it rather than a number of feet setback, which you already,
Well, I mean, I guess it does beg the question, though, that somebody said, like you said, the definition of the roof deck is actually
Right.
just
What is
the-
roof deck?
decking.
So when you say it's not visible, you may not be able to be visible, but is it, so what don't you
What
want to
don't
be
you want? I agree
visible?
with
What
that.
don't
No, I
you
agree
want,
with that.
let's start with what don't you want to be visible?
Well, and that's why this language says, in any barrier required by the building code shall not be visible.
But what if you can
Right.
see the chairs? What if you can see the grill? What if
Well,
I don't know.
it-
That's what we need.
There's not gonna be allowed to be a grill
Not a
because
fixed
we're not
grill,
gonna let
right.
them hard plumb them
Not a
in.
fixed grill.
And you cannot
then
put,
you're not
you
allowed
cannot
to
put a
put-
portable grill up
can't put
there.
portable-
The
Okay.
fire,
But then you've
police
got
will
the
come get.
canvas umbrellas, right?
Which we're allowing, provided they don't become projectiles.
Yeah, well,
You don't
projectiles
want
and
to be walking
winds.
down North Street and get
I
impaled
do
on one of
know.
those, do you?
So let somebody
It was pretty windy out there today.
Oh, yes, right, we would have
Those would have been
downtown
prohibited
projectiles.
today.
So, for example, potted plants and trees, because those are always on the roofs.
What do we not want?
So those are here under sub 3. So if we're going through the language, talking about what do you not want to see. So right now, we're proposing that you say the roof deck and any barrier required by building code shall not be visible from, and we still have to define what public way. The public way that you get your frontage from, the public way across the street, because if you're standing at the toe of the building looking up, you're not going to see
Any
it.
public way that abuts the property.
I would say across the street, 'cause
but the
that's where
barrier
you see
could
it.
be decorative, couldn't it? And it could
Well, like when you
comply.
have a parapet.
Yeah.
I'd say across the
So
street.
that's when you have like.
Opposite side of the street.
Roof slab, but it has like a
Opposite side of the street.
decorative.
I wanna see it.
kind of like, it looks like a big
Right, opposite side of the street of any of the
I thought you meant to go to the
four, any abutting streets.
Because
Well, the
if you're not-
barrier required by the building code might be different than the architectural detailing on the pediment of the building.
Right, but if you have a large, like, and I'm talking architect now, so please correct me. If you have a parapet and it's raised and it's 4 feet above the roof line, that would that act as the barrier? That would comply? Do you know?
I would say it would act as the guardrail barrier to keep you from falling
From a
off.
building code perspective?
For perspective,
You
the
wouldn't
parapet.
need and also need then a fence inside the parapet?
No.
No.
Just need a vertical
Right, so
barrier.
the thing is, they could do something that's attractive. So, for example, and this is not for roof decks, but at the Hingham shipyard, when that was originally permitted, I think I'm the only person left, a lot of those roof lines, when you go down Shipyard Drive, are false. Like, it looks like, but they're really hollow inside, and that's where all the mechanicals were, because we wanted them to screen the mechanicals. So that's the kind of thing that could be done. It looks like there's a full roof up there, but it's really hollow in between.
Again, I wish Andrea was here, right? Because she was specifically making the distinction between
Yep.
the shipyard and downtown, right?
No,
So,
no, no,
like,
I'm talking about what, if you're saying you don't want the barrier to be visible, but if the barrier is a decorative, attractive parapet or roof form, then,
that passes the HDC's
yes,
review.
right.
Which it won't, but, you know.
Right.
Well, you never know.
Well, you never know. You
So
never
do you
know.
just want to change that to say this is not intended to include, you know, the physical walls of the building? Or maybe, because it says any barrier required by building code.
I would-
To me,
that
that's
would-
different than a wall.
But, yeah, but it, well,
Or, I mean, I guess,
If,
does this
well,
go
but-
to your question of, is this something you want to leave to design review? Because depending on the design of the building, the appearance of it may not be bad.
if they are claiming the parapet is the barrier to comply with the building code, then it's allowed.
Tell you, I think
Right?
that,
I
I
mean,
think the
because
idea is
we're
that,
saying the barrier required by the building code. If the parapet,
But you're saying it shall not be visible, but a
Is that
parapet's always going to be
something the
visible.
Zoning board would have discretion under the A2?
No, this
to-
is
historic district.
right. But this, right, the
mean,
roof deck, this is.
I mean, it's all in
this is
A2.
and Site plan, but the site plan review, right, the design review is under the site plan, isn't it?
I mean, I think there could very well be parapets, right, so that's a good point. But there could also be people that don't build a big imposing parapet, and they are gonna just have their minimum railing that they have to
Like
have.
Lincoln Building was going to
but in
do.
order
Like
to
Lincoln
comply
Building was
with
going
the
to do.
guardrail
Yeah.
requirement, it's gonna
So they're gonna
look-
have a see-through.
Right.
It's gonna be see-through, but it's gonna have a lot of peak components to it. It's not just a rail, it's a 4-inch on-center balustrade, and it's 3'6" off the floor, off the roof deck. It's not just a rail.
So you probably don't wanna see that from the public
I don't think
way.
you wanna see a railing from the public way. You could say, if the parapet is part of the building wall, then the parapet's under its own kind of regulation, and it has typically a coping on it, and then anything behind that, as long as it's not visible from across the street, applies to the roof deck,
Yeah.
and that's fine.
Any barrier required by building code excluding exterior walls of the,
The vertical, the top of the vertical wall of the building, which is the parapet.
Any barrier required by a building permit that is not
a
Transparent.
design
consistent,
element of the building?
Not a approved design element or something, it's not a design element of the building.
Yeah.
Because it could also be like on that Lincoln Building, there's that little fencing around the top, which is part of the design
That's a
element.
balustrade
And
parapet.
you would want to see that.
Right.
So,
And you see that with a widow's walk.
So any barrier required by building code that is not a design element of the building or of the structure
A
of the building?
design element that's a required component of the building.
Shall not be visible from, and Gordon said any public way.
no, I said the opposite side of the public ways which abut the structure. So
From the opposite, okay.
the opposite
From
side of the public ways that abut the structure.
That's a good way to put it.
and we're not going to weigh in on umbrellas, right?
Right, so I mean, you can't be standing at the top of Central Street and complain that you can look down onto. you know
Let
what I
me
mean?
finish
We'll be
reading
able to
this.
see it.
So the umbrellas is still in here. So you've got your mock-ups in here. I propose the yellow tape to be strung at a height of 36 inches because that's what the building commissioner said he would require.
My copy I have says 48. Am I looking at an old version?
Probably. Did
Oh,
you,
shoot. I
do you
made all
have
this-
the new one that's laid out in
Oh.
front of you?
Shoot, I made all my comments on the wrong one.
Could you check that again with my, on the height? Guardrail's 42.
I can certainly ask her
Could you?
again.
Yeah,
I got
just-
an email today that Michael was copied on after she
Yeah,
talked to
could
him.
we just ask him
Emily
directly?
talked to Mike, and then Emily emailed me and copied him and said,
I'm not sure, just want to make sure that he saw it. 'cause-
Mike confirmed for me that the minimum height of any barrier, guardrail, fencing required by building code would be 36 inches. Should the mock-up be placed at 36 inches as opposed to 48 inches?
When you, just double check it because there's also a potential of a typo, 36 versus 3'6". I've never done one less than 42, so I just want to double check it, that's all.
So I guess the question for the board is, where do you want the yellow tape at the mock-ups?
I'd say the top of the maximum height of the building, whether it's the parapet or,
Well, the
This rail.
purpose of the mock-up is to determine if you can see the roof deck or the physical barrier that's required by building code.
I would say the top of the proposed, wherever the top of the proposed barrier is going to be, I think that's where the tape would be.
So this language says, yellow tape strung, I think this was Gordon's suggestion, between the poles at a height of 36 inches from the decking or at the proposed elevation of the barrier if greater than 36 inches?
Yeah.
Does that satisfy the
That works.
concerns?
Sounds
Sorry,
good.
I just Googled it and it says 36 inches. Interesting,
Guardrail.
interesting.
Look up
Okay,
guardrail.
I'll read it. The International Residential Code requires balcony railings to be 36 inches high for homes. For business or fencing use, the railing should be 42 or 48 inches. Each community has different height requirements to determine if the porch or balcony requires railings.
Well, it's probably state building code in Massachusetts. It would be under the state. It wouldn't be an individual town
Right, but so that's why the 3642
But it's the international building code that covers it. If it's considered a rail or a guardrail, it's 42. It's the interpretation.
So I think we've covered it by
Yeah.
saying 36 inches
Yeah.
or the proposed elevation of the
Perfect.
barrier if greater than. So then we took out the tiering of the roof decks. So here's Judy's umbrellas. No vertical structures in excess of the minimum height of guardrail or fence required by the state building code shall be permitted on the roof deck, including without limitation trellises, privacy screens, or the like, provided that this provision shall not prohibit natural plantings for screening approved pursuant to site plan or design review. Temporary seasonal umbrellas shall be permitted provided the same are anchored in weighted stands to prevent umbrellas from becoming flying projectiles in windy weather.
What about those little stanchion heaters they have that look like a little umbrella? You know, the restaurants have those heaters that are 6 feet tall. They're great for decks and roof decks.
I think if you can't see it, real.
I think Krista Napoli will have a good time. But so you're satisfied, there's your umbrellas, Judy, and you're comfortable with that?
Thank you.
Okay, so lighting of the roof deck shall be dark sky compliant, and foot candles shall not exceed 0 at the building edges. No light fixtures shall be placed at a height greater than blank.
Well, I mean, you could do the same, I mean, if you have them at, right, it's so people can move around safely too, you don't want people tripping. Right. But if they were at 4 feet, if everything stays at that same kind of height level, that would throw enough light for people to move safely on it, see each other, as opposed to, I don't know, what do you guys think?
Use the same thing as vertical structures, the same language
Yeah.
as in vertical structures. Not in excess of the minimum height of the guardrail or fence required by the state building code.
Yeah, that's what I would say too.
The minimum height of guardrail or fence.
It's the international building code.
Minimum height.
521 CMR.
Guardrail or fence.
I think we should just go with state building code, because that's what Mike's gonna be enforcing.
That's fine.
And that might be the international, but.
Right, it just covers us.
Yep. Okay, and then the last piece of there, the no amplified music, that's not new. That was in there last time. We talked about that. So if we want to go through the other items here,
Can I ask a question? What happened with Judy, just because maybe I missed it? Did you decide to not carve out the single families, or are you carving those out? You're not, okay.
So the language of the submittal requirements,
They're the same as.
we have not changed the submittal requirements, and you have your comments in the margin that explain how, the comments that are pink are things that, you can see it was moved for the January 14th, so that was in your original article. Inserted per January's 14th discussion. We've tried to have descriptive comments for you here. None of this has changed since our last
So why is
meeting.
that capitalized?
Because it's gonna be a defined term.
Oh, I see. And we do that with all defined terms?
It's preferable. Historically, the bylaw didn't do that, but I don't know, maybe about 15 years ago, someone on the planning board recommended that going forward, when there was a defined term, it start being capitalized. So it's not consistent in the bylaw, but it's, over
That's the
time,
direction
it's
we're
been,
heading in.
yes.
Okay.
So those were the changes. I mean, there's additional edits in here, additional track changes, but nothing else has changed pursuant to the last meeting.
Excuse me, on that bottom page 4 there, the recommended 21 days have lapsed. Is that what we want?
Elapsed or lapsed? Should we take out the E?
Have elapsed.
It's lapsed.
Lapsed.
Yeah. You
Have
can say
passed.
Has
I mean, I
passed.
think that this language
And
was
21's the
borrowed
right
from
number.
another.
Do you want to say has passed, Susan or Judy?
21 days
Have passed.
Well, right, so the board would have, well, this is a special permit A2, so that gives you 60 days, 75 days.
75 days technically. We always ask for more.
So the question is, how much time do you want to give the HDC?
And so at the last meeting, we discussed that with Andrea, and she felt where they meet typically every 2 weeks. And if something came in, they certainly could schedule a special meeting. That from the time that it came in, if they had to post it, the 21 days would give them time to post it. And if it was an advisory, they would have time to discuss it.
Well, if it's within their district, then none of this applies and they follow their typical process. If it's just advisory, they don't have to, they can just do the 48-hour posting, so they don't need the same time. So she said 21 was okay. She was fine with 21.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which I was surprised at. I thought they
Yeah.
had more time than that. I thought they only met once a month.
They've been meeting twice a month.
Oh, she said 21 was fine, so.
She said,
Yeah.
Bill looks like he's wrapping up there. Look, his book's closed.
Listen, I think we're ready.
Yeah, nothing,
I'm
right?
ready to make
Nothing
the
else has changed.
Two
since the
happiest guys in the
last
room are gonna be
time
those
you
two
guys
gentlemen
walked
sitting
through-
right there.
And then it also includes the definition of roof deck, which is at the end here, but obviously would be a separate item on the,
yeah, and the last is the definition on the last page 8. But we had discussed that as well, huh?
yes.
Righto.
All right,
We good?
wrapping it up.
All right, I will entertain. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. You guys spent all this time. And I was going to move right on without you.
You can tell he's new to advisory.
Just because of the hour. So you can't see it from the opposite side of the street, but what if you're in the second floor of the house on the opposite side of the street? You can't. That's okay? Okay.
Although we didn't add, that's a good point, obviously, because we didn't add the desire for privacy as being the guiding idea, and so,
But,
You have this competing.
But a special permit A2, I think that the zoning board would be able to put conditions on it that would help ensure privacy.
Well, I think you have these competing goals, because you have a provision in here that's saying you can't have vertical structures such as trellises and privacy screens and everything else, because they may be unattractive to the general public. But without those, it means people are exposed in both directions. People are looking at you on your roof, you're looking potentially at people from your roof. So that's your competing interests there.
The zoning board does balance the impacts to the abutters
Sure.
Right,
really
but
well as part of their
You
A2
do,
here.
right, but there is a provision that says no vertical structures.
Oh, no, correct, but to the point of, what if the neighbors have privacy concerns?
Right.
There would be a duly noticed public
This
hearing.
is the HDC.
Because it's special permit A2.
A2.
Right, so the
But I was
ZBA.
thinking, since it's a private deck, then there's an accountability factor neighbor to neighbor. In other words, someone next door looking out the second floor window into your first floor window, it's neighbor to neighbor. Whereas if there's accountability.
I mean,
Yeah.
what initially would come to mind would be use, right? I mean, sorry, the hours. You could use it.
Well, then there's the noise
The noise,
Well,
right,
as
by
as
law.
us
But in terms of
North
people
Hingham
looking into your
residents can
windows
tell
and
you,
stuff, it's
we know
obviously
exactly
gonna
what's
use
going on in our neighbor's
hours.
backyards.
Right, and I can look right into my neighbor's, all her windows.
My
Every one I
neighbor's
can
deck
look
is
right at.
higher than our deck,
Yeah.
so they're
Yeah.
kind of looking down on us constantly.
Yes, no, we
It's
have the
just-
same
Yeah.
challenge as well.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I used to turn the TV on the other neighbors.
You could do that.
Bradley Woods, I could. Sure
You could
It'd
change
be
your
like,
neighbor's
what?
channels?
Yeah.
I did some landscaping
Till I got in
a couple
trouble.
Years ago when I got tired of seeing what my neighbor was watching on TV.
Wait, so did we vote for this?
Good.
No, you
Not,
didn't.
not
It was
your
a no.
mother-in-law.
No, Andy had disrupted the
Not your
process.
mother-in-law. I couldn't do it to her because of the way they worked the other one.
The progress.
You know, that's the last time I'll exercise my idle curiosity.
Gee, I hope not.
It's the hour, it's the hour.
Listen, Andy
With
and I
that-
have known each other over 30 years, so I'm just taking some liberties with my familiarity with Andy.
So with that, I will entertain a motion to approve Article DDD as revised this evening.
So moved.
All in favor?
All right.
Aye.
Thank you for another year of zoning, gentlemen. Victor, this was your third Victor with us, right? Fourth.
A glut. We took care of all of our other business, so we can
Yes,
we adjourn?
yes.
We are adjourned.
Thank you.